Section 1. The World Before the Griffins. Where it all began. There is a house on a street that should not exist, in a town that no map has ever accurately located, somewhere in the state of Rhode Island. The house is white with red shutters. There is a green mailbox out front. A beat-up station wagon sits in the driveway. Somewhere inside, a baby is plotting the end of the world. A dog is working on a novel he will never finish. A man is eating cereal directly from the box while standing in the kitchen at 2 in the morning because he thought it was a reasonable idea. And somehow, against all logic, against all probability, against every rule of physics and common sense, this family has been doing this for over 25 years. Welcome to the world of Family Guy. Pull up something comfortable, get your blanket, turn down the lights, because tonight we are going to take our time walking through every strange, layered, deeply weird story that lives inside this animated world. Every piece of backstory, every hidden connection, every moment of lore that most people walked right past because they were too busy laughing at the joke in front of it to notice the one hiding underneath. This is not a countdown. This is not a ranked list. This is a long, quiet journey through one of the strangest fictional universes ever put on television, told in the way it deserves to be told. Slowly, thoroughly, with a lot of attention paid to the corners of the room that most people never bother to look at. So let us start at the very beginning, not with the first episode, and not with Peter standing at the stove making pancakes. Let us start even further back than that. Let us start with the town itself. The fictional city where Family Guy takes place is called, and you will know this name already, a small coastal settlement in Rhode Island. The show's creator, Seth MacFarlane, attended the Rhode Island School of Design, and when it came time to set the show somewhere, the New England state just felt right. It had that specific kind of blue-collar, middle-class, slightly weather-beaten atmosphere that the show was always trying to capture. The name of the town is itself a piece of wordplay. A quahog is a type of hard-shelled clam native to the northeastern United States. It is, in other words, a very Rhode Island kind of name. And the show leans into that. The local beer is called Pawtucket Patriot Ale, a reference to the real Massachusetts city of Pawtucket, which sits right on the border. The characters have thick New England sensibilities. The geography shifts based on the needs of any given episode, but the spirit of the place stays consistent. And here's one of the first pieces of lore that most people never think about. The street the Griffins live on is called Spooner Street. Seth MacFarlane has said in DVD commentaries that the street was named after Spooner Hill Road, which was the road near his childhood home in Connecticut. It is a small, personal detail buried inside a fictional address, a piece of the creator's own life pressed into the architecture of this world, like a thumbprint. The address itself is 31 Spooner Street, and that address became oddly significant when an episode revealed that for many years, the Griffin House did not actually appear on any official map of the town. The property simply was not registered. It existed outside the official record. This became the premise of an entire episode, Season 2's political satire story, where Peter discovers his land is technically not part of the United States and promptly declares it a sovereign nation. That nation was called Peturia. It lasted about as long as you would expect a nation led by Peter Griffin to last, which is to say not long at all, but for a brief and chaotic few days. There was a separate country operating out of a house on a residential street in Rhode Island. And the United States government responded with actual sanctions and military posturing. Because even the background details of this show go to strange places if you follow them far enough. But we are not done with the town yet. Because this city has a history that predates the Griffins by several centuries, and that history is woven into the show in ways that sneak up on you if you are paying attention. In the 7th season episode called Peter's Progress, the show takes a long look backward through time using a past lives narrative device. Through this story, it is revealed that an ancestor of Peter Griffin named Griffin Peterson was actually the founder of the town. He was exiled to the New World from the 17th century England by a king named King Stewart III, and after a series of misadventures in the colonies, he won control of the settlement in a talent show. A talent show. The man who would become the spiritual ancestor of Peter Griffin founded an entire city by winning a talent competition. The king offered him the deed to the whole town as a prize. Griffin Peterson accepted, renamed the settlement, and that was that. The town was born from a bet, essentially, which, if you think about it, is the most fitting origin story possible. There is a church in this town. There is a high school named James Woods Regional High School, named after the actor James Woods, who appears in the show as a recurring character and occasional villain. There is a bar called the Drunken Clam, which functions as the emotional center of gravity for Peter and his friends. There is a local news station called Channel 5 News, which employs a pompous anchor named Tom Tucker and an Asian American reporter named Trisha Takanawa, both of whom deliver the kind of local news coverage that feels both absurdist and uncomfortably accurate to how local news actually operates. There is a mall. There is a hospital. There is a city hall that has been occupied by one of the most entertainingly bizarre political figures in animation history, a man named Mayor Adam West, voiced by the actual Adam West, who was famous for playing Batman in the 1960s television series. Mayor Adam West governed this fictional city with a style that can only be described as deeply disconnected from the basic requirements of municipal governance. He once used city funds to buy a solid gold house shaped like himself. He declared war on a fictional country because of a board game. He governed for years and years, and the city kept electing him back into office, which says something interesting about both the residents of this town and the relationship between voters and charming incompetence. And one block off Spooner Street, there is a small reference that almost nobody notices unless they are looking for it. The street that runs alongside Spooner Street is called McFarlane, as in McFarlane. Seth MacFarlane. The creator of the show gave himself a street. Not loudly, not in a way that demands attention. Just quietly. In the background of the world he built, his name is embedded in the geography of the place. This is the world the Griffins live in. Layered, strange, full of history, both invented and borrowed. And now it is time to talk about how the Griffins themselves came to exist. Before Family Guy was ever a television show, before it was even an idea pitched to a network, it was two short animated films made by a young man at art school. Seth MacFarlane was a student at the Rhode Island School of Design, and while he was there, he made a short animated film called The Life of Larry. This film featured a middle-aged man named Larry and his anthropomorphic dog named Steve. If you track down these shorts today, the resemblance is immediate. Larry is clearly the rough draft of Peter Griffin. Steve is clearly the rough draft of Brian. The body shapes are different, the voices are different, but the dynamic is there. A bumbling, affable man and an intellectual dog who is smarter than everyone around him. MacFarlane made a sequel film, also called Larry and Steve, and these two films caught the attention of people at Fox, who saw in them the seeds of something bigger. They gave MacFarlane $50,000 to develop a pilot. He spent 6 months animating it almost entirely by himself, and the result was an 11-minute short that introduced the Griffin family to the world in December of 1998. Fox liked what they saw. They greenlit a series. And on January 31st, 1999, right after Super Bowl 33, Family Guy premiered to an audience of approximately 22 million people. 22 million. Think about that number for a moment, because it becomes important later when we look at what happened to the ratings over the years. A show that launched with 22 million eyeballs and the energy of a cultural event. The kind of debut that networks dream about. But before any of that happened, before Peter Griffin ever appeared on a television screen, before Stewie ever delivered a single villainous monologue from his high chair, there was Rhode Island. There was a young animator with a clear vision. There were two short films that almost nobody saw. And there was a world slowly being assembled from scratch by someone who cared about every detail, including which street their fictional family would live on and what that street would be named. That is how the story begins. Not with a laugh, with a blueprint. And now, before we go any further, I want to take a moment to say something. If you are watching this right now, wherever you are, whatever time it is, whatever is on your mind tonight, drop a comment and tell me. Tell me the time and the place. Tell me where you are watching from. It helps more than you might think, and I genuinely want to know who is in this room with me tonight. Subscribe if you have not already, because what we are about to walk through together is going to take a while, and it is going to be worth it. Now, let us take one more long look at the world itself before we start filling it with people. The fictional town has a geography that shifts to accommodate whatever any given episode requires. It has a coastline in some episodes. It is inland in others. It has an international airport, which in real Rhode Island only exists in Warwick. It has an extensive metro system, which real Rhode Island does not have in any meaningful sense. The show's writers have never been particularly concerned with geographic consistency, and they have occasionally acknowledged this by having characters themselves comment on the town's apparently fluid physical dimensions. In one episode, a map visible in a background scene does not resemble any actual Providence neighborhood map in any recognizable way. The town is a construct that exists at the level of feeling rather than cartography. The Channel 5 News building is a recurring landmark that never seems to be in quite the same location relative to everything else. The courthouse has appeared in multiple episodes with different interior configurations. The mall has a layout that shifts between visits. This is the nature of a show that builds its world out of comedic necessity rather than architectural planning. You add what you need for the current episode and trust that nobody is keeping precise notes. Some people are keeping precise notes. Family Guy has one of the most dedicated fan wikis in all of animated television, a resource that has tracked every character appearance, every location, every continuity error, and every piece of background detail across the show's entire run. This wiki contains information about the history of every building on Spooner Street, the full ancestral trees of every main character, the complete filmography of every real celebrity who has appeared on the show in any capacity, and the specific air dates and production codes of every episode produced since 1999. It is, in its way, a tribute to the depth of engagement that this show has generated, a monument to the fact that 25 years of detailed storytelling, even storytelling that frequently contradicts itself, produces something worth documenting thoroughly. The show's relationship to Rhode Island as a real place has generated occasional tension. When the show first aired, various organizations and public figures from the real state occasionally responded to references made in the show. The creators were aware of this sensitivity, which is part of why they chose to make their fictional city fictional, rather than setting the show in a real Rhode Island town. The compromise, Maquia, basing the geography on real places while inventing a fictional name, allowed the show to have the specific New England flavor it wanted, while maintaining enough distance to avoid the kind of civic backlash that had burned earlier writers in their previous projects. The Pawtucket Patriot Brewery has become one of the most beloved fictional workplaces in animation history. It is not a glamorous place. It is a working brewery with the specific smell and atmosphere you would expect from a place that makes large quantities of inexpensive beer. Peter loves it there. He loves the beer and the routine and the colleagues and the familiar rhythms of showing up every day to do something he understands. His relationship to work is one of the show's quieter running threads. In the early seasons especially, Peter's identity as a working-class man who takes genuine pride in his place in the workforce was an important part of what made him relatable to the show's core audience. The show premiered on January 31st, 1999, a Sunday night, in the time slot immediately following Super Bowl 33. If you want to understand how significant that debut was in practical terms, consider what it means for a show's first episode to be watched by 22 million people. Most television shows launch to a few million viewers and consider it a success. 22 million on day one is an event. It is the kind of number that creates instant cultural traction, that makes people talk about what they saw at work on Monday morning, that gets the show into the broader conversation before anyone has had a chance to decide whether they like it or not. The Super Bowl slot did not guarantee Family Guy's success, but it gave it something more valuable in the short term. It gave it an audience that was already gathered and already in the mood for entertainment, and it gave the creators a chance to say hello to 22 million people at once. The first episode was called Death Has a Shadow. It established the core family dynamics with impressive efficiency. Peter makes a mistake at work. The family has to deal with the consequences. Everyone plays their role. The humor was already in place. The cutaways, the character voices, the specific rhythm of the comedy. But more importantly, the warmth was already there. You could feel in that first episode that these characters liked each other, that the chaos was a feature of love rather than a product of its absence, that underneath all the noise there was a family trying its best. That is the foundation that everything else was built on, and it is worth holding on to as we go deeper into the stories, because the foundation never fully disappeared. Even in the show's most difficult later periods, there were episodes that reached back down into it and found it still there, still warm, still capable of sustaining something real. Now, let us talk about the people who actually live in this world. Section 2. Peter Griffin, the man behind the mythology. There is a specific kind of person that Peter Griffin was designed to be in those first 3 seasons, and it is worth spending real time understanding that original version, because everything that makes the character fascinating, including his later transformation into something far stranger and more extreme, only makes sense if you understand who he started out as. Peter Justin Griffin was born in Newport County, Rhode Island. His birth certificate, briefly visible in a later season episode, confirms this detail. He grew up in a working-class Irish-American Catholic household. His mother was a woman named Thelma Griffin, who was loving in the imperfect way that tired, overextended mothers often are, and who smoked heavily throughout most of Peter's childhood. His father, Francis Griffin, was a strict, emotionally cold man who made his disapproval of Peter a central feature of their relationship. Francis was a devout Roman Catholic who found fault in nearly everything Peter did and said, and the tension between them runs quietly through the early seasons of the show. But here's the first piece of genuinely strange lore attached to Peter's origin. Francis Griffin is not actually Peter's biological father. This is revealed in a Season 4 episode called Peter's Two Dads, and the information lands with the kind of quiet devastation that the show occasionally managed before the humor took over entirely. Peter's biological father is a man named Mickey McFinnigan, an Irish drifter who had a one-night encounter with Thelma decades before. Peter tracks down Mickey and finds him in Ireland, and the whole episode becomes this strange, melancholy journey through the question of what makes a man your father. Is it biology? Is it the years of criticism and disappointment? Is it the religious rigidity and the emotional distance? In some ways, finding out that Francis was not his biological father gave Peter a kind of freedom he had never had. And in other ways, it just added another layer of loss to a character who had been carrying the weight of Francis's disapproval his entire life. Mickey McFinnigan, for his part, is exactly the kind of person you might expect Peter's biological father to be. He is loud, he is cheerful, he is deeply irresponsible. He wins bar fights and laughs about it. He is Peter without the self-awareness, which is a terrifying thought, but also a clarifying one. You can look at Peter Griffin and trace certain things back to genetics, and other things back to the man who raised him. Peter grew up, got a job, met a girl, and married her. The job was at the happy-go-lucky toy factory in the town. The girl was Lois Pewterschmidt, the daughter of one of the wealthiest families in Rhode Island. And the meeting happened because Peter was working as a towel boy at a country club owned by Lois's great-aunt. He handed her a towel. She laughed at something he said. And somewhere in that exchange, something clicked that would never fully unclick. Lois's father, Carter Pewterschmidt, did not approve of this relationship, to put it mildly. Carter is a billionaire industrialist who plays poker with Bill Gates and Ted Turner, who once won CNN in a card game, who owns U.S. Steel and runs Pewterschmidt Industries. The idea of his daughter marrying a towel boy from a working-class Irish family was, to Carter, an affront to everything he had spent his life building. He offered Peter $1 million to stay away from Lois. When that failed, he tried other approaches, including at various points attempting to have Peter removed, humiliated, or simply erased from the situation. Through the application of money and influence, none of it worked. Peter and Lois got married. Peter and Saa, they moved into the house on Spooner Street that they technically could not prove they owned. They had 3 children, and Peter went from the happy-go-lucky toy factory to a job at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, which became the central anchor of his working life for most of the show's run. His boss at the brewery was a man named Angela, a dry and perpetually exhausted supervisor who represented the specific energy of someone who has accepted that the chaos is never going to stop. Angela appeared for many seasons and eventually died of natural causes in a later episode, which the show acknowledged with more genuine sadness than most people expected. Peter's friends are worth understanding in their own right. Joe Swanson, who lives 2 doors down at 33 Spooner Street, is a police officer who is paralyzed from the waist down after an encounter with a criminal on a rooftop. Joe uses a wheelchair and approaches life with the kind of intense physical confidence that you sometimes find in people who have been through something genuinely hard and decided to come out the other side stronger. He is loud, competitive, loyal, and genuinely skilled in ways that his friends often overlook because they are too busy being themselves. Cleveland Brown, who was part of the original group on Spooner Street before leaving to become the central character of a spin-off show, was the steady, mild-mannered counterweight to Peter's chaos. He had a measured quality that came across as calm from the outside, but sometimes felt like exhaustion from the inside. And then there is Glenn, the pilot who lives next door. We will spend dedicated time with him later. But the core of the friend group, Peter, Joe, Cleveland, and Glenn, was always held together not by shared interests or compatible personalities, but by geography and habit. They are the friends you have because they live close enough that stopping in on the way home becomes a routine. The Drunken Clam, the local bar that functions as their meeting ground, is not a glamorous place. It has a stuffed fish on the wall. The drinks are cheap, the lighting is dim, and in the early seasons especially, the conversations that happen there felt like the kinds of conversations that actually happen between men who are not sure how to talk to each other, but keep trying anyway. The mythology around Peter himself goes very deep, in ways that the show explored in short bursts across many different episodes. The episode about the Griffin family history, which aired in the 4th season, took all of this and collapsed it into a single night of storytelling. Trapped in a panic room with burglars in the house, Peter passes the time by narrating the history of his family going back to the very beginning of time. And what that history reveals is a lineage of absolute absurdity that somehow manages to be consistent in its chaos. In the beginning, according to Peter, was the universe itself. And the universe was created by God accidentally igniting his own flatulence with a lighter. This is how the Griffin worldview operates. Even the creation of the cosmos gets filtered through the specific comedy sensibility of this family. From there, the history moves through the Paleolithic Age, where an ancestor of Peter invented the wheel. Then through the Bronze Age, where Moses Griffin led the Israelites to freedom from Egypt. Moses Griffin, in this telling, is less the solemn prophet of the Old Testament, and more like a man who is extremely tired of people reading billboards out loud while he is trying to have a conversation. The 10 Commandments he delivers include instructions like, "When we pass a billboard, please do not read it out loud," and "shut the hell up." This is how the show approaches religion, not with anger or contempt, but with the casual irreverence of someone who finds the human side of sacred things genuinely funny. There is a Peter ancestor who shot Abraham Lincoln, not for political reasons, but because Lincoln did bunny ears in a photo booth picture and the ancestor took personal offense. There is a King Arthur version of Peter who managed to make King Arthur's quest for Excalibur into something fundamentally undignified. There is a Ponce de Leon-inspired ancestor who found the Fountain of Youth, waded into it, and emerged with the body of an infant, but kept his adult head attached, which he declared entirely worth the 8.5-year boat trip. There is Peter Hitler. This requires a moment of explanation. Peter Hitler was the brother of Adolf Hitler, and the joke is that he was so profoundly annoying to his brother that he may have accidentally destabilized the entire Third Reich through sheer persistent irritation. He wanted to help. He kept interrupting. He gave enthusiastic feedback that nobody asked for. And in the end, he accidentally shot both Hitler and Eva Braun while playing with a gun, and then covered it up to make it look like a suicide. The historical implication is left hanging there for the audience to sit with. And then there is Nate Griffin, who was introduced in a different episode earlier in the show's run, and revisited in the family history episode. Nate Griffin was Peter's great-great-great-great-grandfather, and his story is told with more weight than most of the other ancestors receive. He was kidnapped from a village in Africa, brought to America on a slave ship, eventually wound up working on a plantation owned by the Pewterschmidt family, yes, Lois's ancestors, and fell in love with the Pewterschmidt family's daughter, with whom he built a secret family. The connection between the Griffins and the Pewterschmidts goes back centuries, to a love story that had to be hidden because the world would not allow it to be anything else. This is the undercurrent that runs beneath all the absurdist humor in this show. The Griffin family history is not just a collection of jokes. It is a compressed version of American history, told through one family's distorted lens. Slavery, immigration, war, ambition, reinvention, all of it is in there, buried under the comedy. Peter's own past before the show begins has other surprising details. It is revealed in different episodes that he was close friends with James Woods at one point, before a betrayal turned Woods into a recurring antagonist. He briefly served in a military capacity that he largely cannot account for. He once ran a small business that failed. He has a surprising number of adventures in his backstory that emerge slowly across seasons, each one filling in a piece of the picture without quite connecting it to the one before. Peter Griffin, properly examined, is not a simple character. He is a man with an enormous amount of history that he himself does not fully understand, mostly because he does not pay close attention to his own life. His IQ has been tested in the show. The results are not good. In the episode called Pat Ardebaya, Peter is diagnosed with a level of intellectual disability that legally qualifies him for certain protections, a fact he initially weaponizes before the episode reaches its more complicated resolution. The diagnosis itself has been retconned or ignored in other episodes, as happens with most factual details in a show that runs on a floating timeline. But the spirit of it remains. Peter Griffin is not a smart man. He operates on instinct, impulse, and a kind of genuine goodwill that the show periodically remembers and periodically forgets. In the early seasons, when that goodwill was the foundation of the character, Peter Griffin was genuinely lovable. He was the guy who would get himself into impossible situations through nothing more than poor judgment and then stumble his way towards something that looked like a solution. He was capable of real tenderness with Lois. He had a genuine sensitivity to things he cared about, his friends, his beer, his television, that made his obliviousness to everything else feel like contrast rather than character defect. When he messed up, he usually felt bad about it. When he caused harm, he usually tried to repair it. That moral feedback loop is what made him feel like a person rather than a cartoon of a person, and it is the thing that the later seasons slowly stripped away. But in those early years, sitting in that house on Spooner Street, Peter Griffin was something genuinely interesting. He was the American working-class father rendered in cartoon form, but with enough humanity beneath the exaggeration to make him feel real. He drove a red station wagon. He drank Pawtucket Patriot Ale. He watched too much television. He had opinions about things he did not understand. He loved his family in the clumsy, imperfect way that a lot of people love the things they are most afraid to lose. And somewhere in the walls of that house on Spooner Street, if you listen quietly enough, you can still hear the version of him that existed before everything got louder. Let us also spend time on the specific texture of Peter's daily life, because the details accumulate into something more interesting than the broad strokes suggest. Peter wakes up in the same house every morning. He eats cereal, often directly from the box, standing at the kitchen counter. He watches television with the specific enthusiasm of someone who finds it genuinely satisfying in a way that most adults have been conditioned to treat as embarrassing. He is not embarrassed. He laughs at things that make him laugh. He watches programming from the 1970s and 1980s with a nostalgia that functions as his primary mode of engaging with culture. He has opinions about specific episodes of shows that aired before some of his children were born, and these opinions are expressed at full volume without concern for whether anyone present cares about them. He drives a red Ford country sedan station wagon. The car is not in good condition. The car has been in bad condition for as long as the show has existed, gradually accumulating new damage while somehow maintaining its basic functionality. It is the automotive equivalent of Peter himself. Battered, barely passing inspection, but still going. His work at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery has a social dimension that matters to him. The people he works with are part of his daily reality in a way that his neighbors sometimes are not. His relationship with his boss, Angela, was one of the show's quieter long-term character dynamics. The specific weariness of a supervisor who has accepted that her employee is never going to fully meet expectations, but who continues to hold the expectation anyway, because letting go of it entirely would feel like giving something up. Angela died in a later season, and the episode that addressed her death did so with more genuine weight than the show typically brings to character loss. Peter's reaction to losing her said something real about how much she had meant to him, even in the form of a daily reminder of his own limitations. Peter's Catholic faith is a recurring element of his characterization that the show handles inconsistently but interestingly across its run. Francis Griffin's religious intensity created in Peter both a deep, structural Catholicism, the kind that persists in behavior and reflex long after doctrinal belief has gone quiet, and a complicated relationship to its demands. Peter goes to church. He takes his children to church, or means to, or has done it in the past. He makes the sign of the cross in moments of genuine fear. But he also has a casual relationship to morality that does not seem to involve much active consultation of religious principles. His faith is ambient. It is in the background of who he is, like the accent of a place you grew up in that shows up in how you pronounce certain words even decades after you moved away. The show has explored Peter's faith directly in multiple episodes. In the third season episode A Mission Impossible, his Catholic beliefs about family size and contraception become plot relevant. In later episodes, the question of what Peter actually believes versus what he performs as belief gets more complicated. The show does not resolve this question cleanly, which may be the most honest thing it does about religion. Acknowledging that for many people, faith is not a simple, consistent, internally coherent system, but a collection of things inherited and retained and questioned and kept for reasons that are not always fully articulate. Peter's relationship with his father's ghost is one of the stranger pieces of his backstory. Francis Griffin died in a Season 5 episode, and his ghost has appeared several times afterward, primarily to continue criticizing Peter in the same way he did while alive. The continuity of the criticism across the boundary between life and death is played for comedy. Death apparently has not made Francis any more reconciled to who his son is. But it also says something about how deeply certain voices embed themselves in us. Francis's disapproval is so thoroughly a part of Peter's psychological architecture that even after Francis is gone, Peter continues to experience it. His biological father, Mickey McFinnigan, by contrast, represents a different kind of absence. Peter did not grow up knowing Mickey existed. He spent his formative years under Francis's critical gaze without the counterweight of knowing there was another man out there whose genes he carried. A man for whom life was lighter and less governed by religious obligation and the weight of other people's expectations. Finding Mickey in Ireland was, in one interpretation, an act of emotional archaeology. Peter going to look for the version of himself that might have been, if the paternal circumstances had been different. The accident of parentage runs through Peter's story in ways the show explores, and then drops, and then occasionally picks up again. He is the product of an absent biological father and a domineering adoptive one, of a mother who was loving but overextended, of a working-class tradition that valued certain kinds of toughness and certain kinds of loyalty and had limited patience for the kind of introspection that might have helped everyone understand what they were doing to each other. He is, in other words, a recognizable American type, a man shaped by forces he did not choose and has never fully examined, doing his best with the particular equipment life gave him, and mostly not knowing he needs different equipment. This is the Peter Griffin who existed in those first 3 seasons, and who, even in his later, more extreme form, you can still find if you look carefully at the right moments. He is still there. Under the cruelty and the chaos and the accelerating extremity, there is still a working-class man from Rhode Island who loves his wife and his friends and his beer and his television, and who is doing his best with a life he is not entirely sure he deserves. Section 3. Lois Griffin. The woman who chose all of this. There is a version of Lois Griffin's life that went in a very different direction. In that version, she married a man named Jerome, who appears briefly in later seasons as a former flame she reconnects with. A man who is sophisticated and successful and everything that Peter is not. In that version, she stayed in the world her parents built for her. She attended the right schools, attended the right events, wore the right clothes, and became the person that Carter and Barbara Pewterschmidt spent her childhood grooming her to be. She chose not to be that person. She handed a towel to a boy at a country club, and she laughed at something he said, and she chose. Lois Patrice Pewterschmidt was born in 1958 to one of the wealthiest families in Rhode Island. Her father, Carter Roosevelt Pewterschmidt, was a billionaire industrialist whose business holdings included U.S. Steel, Pewterschmidt Industries, and at various points CNN, which he won in a poker game from Ted Turner. Carter's personal philosophy is essentially a very elegant form of the belief that money is the only true measure of human value, and everyone without it exists primarily to be useful to those with it. He is not without complexity. The show occasionally gives him moments of genuine feeling, usually around Lois, but his default setting is contempt. Barbara Pewterschmidt, Lois's mother, is a more layered figure than she first appears. On the surface, she is the classic New England patrician wife, composed and proper and loyal to Carter's vision of what their family should be. But the show eventually reveals that Barbara is Jewish, specifically that she is a Jewish Holocaust survivor who spent decades hiding her identity within the WASP establishment she had married into. This comes out in an episode called Family Goy, and the revelation reframes everything we have seen of Barbara up to that point. She was not simply performing propriety, she was protecting herself. She had learned through the worst possible education that who you really are can be a liability, and she had made a calculation about what kind of self to present to the world. Lois inherited the suppression instinct, though she channeled it differently. She became the keeper of the family's functional surface. She makes the meals and manages the schedules and smooths over the crises and holds the structure together with the specific, exhausted competence of someone who knows that if she stops, everything falls apart. This was always one of the most honest things about the show's early characterization of Lois. She is not simply the sensible wife of cartoon convention. She is a woman who made a choice to be in this chaotic family and has been managing the consequences of that choice every day since. Her backstory is darker than most people realize. Lois has a brother named Patrick Pewterschmidt, who was institutionalized for much of his adult life after a psychological break turned him into a serial killer who targeted overweight men. He walked in on his mother engaged in a sexual encounter with the actor Jackie Gleason when he was a child, and the trauma of that moment, combined with the specific pressures of growing up in the Pewterschmidt household, produced a man who eventually turned his psychological pain outward in the most extreme possible way. Patrick appears in a Season 5 episode called The Fat Guy Strangler, and his arc is played with an unsettling mixture of dark humor and genuine sadness. He is not portrayed as a monster. He is portrayed as a man who broke under a specific kind of pressure and whose family's response was to make him disappear rather than deal with the problem. Lois also has a younger sister named Carol, who is gentler and somewhat more grounded than the rest of the Pewterschmidt clan. Carol eventually marries Adam West, the mayor of the town, which makes Peter Griffin and Batman's Adam West technically brothers-in-law, which is exactly the kind of detail that becomes unremarkable in this universe. What Lois brought from the Pewterschmidt household into her marriage with Peter was not just a desire for something different. She also brought a set of skills and capacities that run far deeper than the show always remembered to acknowledge. She is a trained pianist. She has a black belt in taijutsu, which comes up periodically in episodes where the show needs Lois to be physically capable. She is genuinely intelligent, the kind of intelligent that gets smoothed over and redirected in the domestic role she chose, but that surfaces whenever the situation demands it. In one episode, she is elected mayor. In another, she works as a reporter for a news station. In another, she becomes a highly effective phone sex operator. In another, she gets into boxing and discovers she is very good at hitting people. The episode Baby You Knock Me Out from Season 8 is one of the more interesting character pieces built around Lois. She discovers in this episode that she has a natural gift for fighting, and the revelation does something to her sense of herself. For a brief period, she becomes a prize fighter, winning bouts against professional competition and building something that looks like a separate identity from the wife and mother role she usually inhabits. The episode eventually resolves in a way that restores the status quo, as it always does. But the window it opens into who Lois could be under different circumstances is genuinely compelling. She is also not without her own shadows. The show reveals over time that Lois has a complicated relationship with compulsive behavior. She goes through a period of kleptomania so severe that she ends up in prison. She has a significant gambling addiction that surfaces at a casino in the first season. Multiple episodes hint at recreational drug use going back decades, including a revelation in a DVD commentary from Seth MacFarlane himself that Lois smoked marijuana while pregnant with Stewie, which MacFarlane offered as a tongue-in-cheek explanation for some of Stewie's more unusual psychological characteristics. In one of the show's genuinely unexpected revelations, Lois made a pornographic film during her college years. This is not treated, when it comes up in the later seasons, as a secret that defines her character negatively. It is treated as evidence of the full, complicated, privately lived life that exists inside every person, even the person standing in front of you making breakfast sandwiches on a Tuesday morning. What makes Lois interesting, and what the show occasionally forgets in its later seasons, when her characterization becomes more erratic and more mean-spirited, is that she chose her life with full knowledge of what she was choosing. She did not stumble into poverty or domesticity or Peter Griffin's particular brand of chaos. She looked at all of it and said yes. She grew up surrounded by wealth and order, and the specific coldness that tends to accompany both. And she looked at a towel boy with bad judgment and good instincts, and she saw something worth choosing. That choice is the emotional foundation of the entire show. The Griffin family exists because Lois Pewterschmidt looked at her options and picked the one that made her father furious. And somewhere in that choice is the whole argument the show makes about what actually makes a life worth living. It is not the right address. It is not the correct social circle. It is not the money or the prestige or the carefully managed exterior. It is the chaos that you love enough to stay in. Lois's darker side, which the show develops with increasing intensity across the middle and later seasons, is also worth exploring because it complicates the simple narrative of the patient, capable mother holding everything together. Lois is not simply good. She is not simply reasonable. The capacity for manipulation that she inherited from the Pewterschmidt household, the strategic use of charm and propriety to achieve desired outcomes, shows up in her behavior with Peter and with her children in ways that are sometimes funny and sometimes unsettling. In several episodes, Lois is revealed to have been managing Peter's behavior through subtle misdirection for years. She does not simply respond to his chaos. She sometimes anticipates and redirects it in ways that look passive, but are actually calculated. She has a clearer picture of what is happening in the Griffin household than Peter does, which is not a high bar, but she sometimes uses that clarity to arrange outcomes rather than to be transparent about what she wants. This is the Pewterschmidt in her, the training in a household where saying what you want directly is less efficient than creating the conditions under which you get it. The episode "And I'm Joyce Kinney" from Season 9 is one of the most interesting explorations of Lois's inner life. A new news reporter named Joyce Kinney befriends Lois and then, on live television, airs the pornographic film Lois made in college. The episode deals with public shaming, the permanence of the past in the digital age, and the question of who gets to decide what defines someone. Lois's response to the revelation is more interesting than the revelation itself. She does not collapse, and she does not simply defend herself. She engages with the situation with the particular pragmatism of someone who has long since made peace with the complicated history she carries, and who does not particularly feel the need to apologize for who she has been. Her relationship with her own mother is quietly complicated in a way that most of the characters around her do not notice. Barbara Pewterschmidt spent decades hiding her Jewish identity within the WASP establishment she had married into. The discipline required to maintain that concealment for that length of time is enormous, and it required a kind of internal compartmentalization that Lois appears to have inherited. Lois is not hiding a secret as significant as her mother's, but she has a similar capacity to keep separate parts of her life in separate containers, to present the version of herself appropriate to each context without fully integrating them into a single coherent self. This is one of the things that makes Lois one of the more psychologically interesting characters in the show's run, when the writing is paying attention to it. She is not transparent. She is legible. You can understand her motivations if you watch carefully, but she is not simple. And the life she chose by marrying Peter is in some ways the most genuinely countercultural choice she could have made within her family context, a complete rejection of the model her parents provided. She did not just marry a less wealthy man. She married into a different way of being in the world entirely, and she has been living inside that choice for the entire run of the show. Her voice, as performed by Alex Borstein, was originally slower and lower than it eventually became. Borstein in interviews has described the voice as having been based on a relative from Long Island, and MacFarlane asked her to make it faster and higher over the first few seasons. The result is a voice that sounds entirely natural now, but was actually calibrated through trial and adjustment, shaped by creative collaboration into the specific sound that Lois Griffin has. This is true of all the main voices on the show. MacFarlane's choices for Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Glenn, were all developed through similar processes of specific inspiration and deliberate refinement. But Lois's is notable because it underwent the most visible evolution in the show's early period. Section 4. Brian Griffin, the dog who carries the weight of the world. There is something quietly devastating about Brian Griffin if you look at him long enough. He is a white Labrador retriever. He stands on two legs. He drives a silver Toyota Prius with a Kucinich 2004 bumper sticker on the back. He drinks martinis. He attends cocktail parties and discusses literature with people who do not know they are talking to a dog. He has written, or rather tried to write, a novel called Faster Than the Speed of Love for going on a decade, producing very little beyond the title and a synopsis that one character describes as sounding like a direct-to-video action movie from the early 1990s. He attended Brown University but dropped out one course shy of graduation, which is a detail the show returns to periodically with the kind of grim persistence that suggests it is not going to be allowed to go away. He was born on a farm in Austin, Texas, in a litter of 5 puppies. His mother was named Biscuit. His father was named Coco. Coco, Brian has noted, was a racist. His mother eventually abandoned the litter, a piece of his history that the show treats as the root of most of Brian's psychological complications, particularly his drinking, his compulsive need for validation, and his persistent inability to finish anything he starts. He later saw his mother as a taxidermy mount in someone's house, which is one of the few moments in the show's entire run that earns genuine emotional weight through sheer, unexpected specificity. Peter found Brian walking along a road and brought him home. The full story is told in the Season 1 episode Brian Portrait of a Dog, which is one of the earliest episodes to give Brian significant depth as a character. Peter saw a stray dog, recognized something in him, and brought him home. And Brian has been there ever since, occupying a strange position in the household that the show never quite decided to either fully commit to or abandon. He is a pet and also a family member. He is an animal and also a person. He is the family dog and also, as one character puts it, something closer to a roommate who happens to not pay rent. Brian attended Brown University. This is mentioned in the Season 4 episode Brian Goes Back to College, in which he returns to finish his degree after discovering that he was never properly enrolled in the first place and has been using his partial college experience to build a social identity that rests on a slightly false foundation. He is asked to write for The New Yorker in that same episode. He gets the invitation revoked when they discover he never graduated. This is quintessential Brian Griffin. He reaches for the thing, gets close enough to touch it, and then something about his past or his habits or his fundamental inability to follow through pulls it away at the last moment. His novel, Faster Than the Speed of Love, is eventually published. Not because it is good. Carter Pewterschmidt uses it as a bargaining chip in an episode, having 2 million copies printed and arranging for Oprah Winfrey to endorse it, in exchange for Brian performing a public concert promoting the recriminalization of marijuana, a position Brian had been campaigning against. The book goes out into the world with the full force of the Pewterschmidt money machine behind it and is universally destroyed by critics. It does not sell a single copy. Tom Tucker reports on the failure in a local news broadcast, noting that it has set a record for the worst-selling novel of all time. Then, in a separate episode, Brian receives an invitation from the Rhode Island Society for Special Literary Excellence to an awards ceremony celebrating the novel. He tells everyone about it. He goes dressed for a prestigious literary event. The ceremony is held at a pizza parlor and is attended by a group of people with cognitive disabilities who were delighted by the book for reasons that have nothing to do with its literary merit. The word special in the Society's name did not mean what Brian thought it meant. The writing career storyline is one of the most consistent and detailed character threads in the entire show. It goes across seasons, it has continuity, it tracks consequences, and it says something real about the experience of wanting to be an artist and not being quite good enough, and the complicated relationship between ambition and delusion. Brian wants to be a serious writer more than he wants almost anything else. And the show is ruthless about the gap between that want and his actual output. He also has a son. Dylan Flanagan appears in the Season 6 episode The Former Life of Brian, and the revelation of his existence is a complicated piece of Brian's backstory. Dylan was conceived during a relationship Brian had years before the show begins. Brian was absent for Dylan's entire childhood, and the episode deals directly with the consequences of that absence. Dylan has grown up angry and undirected, and Brian's attempts to be a father to him in the episode are messy and imperfect in the way that all attempts to repair neglect tend to be. They do connect by the episode's end, but it is earned through difficulty rather than easy sentiment. Brian is also, for much of the show, quietly in love with Lois Griffin. This is acknowledged multiple times across the series with varying degrees of seriousness. In the early seasons, it is handled with a kind of sad dignity. Brian carries a feeling he knows is inappropriate and tries to keep it contained. He is Peter's best friend. He lives in Peter's house. He has no illusions about the possibility of it going anywhere. But the feeling is there, and it affects his behavior in small ways that the show occasionally pauses to acknowledge before moving on. His friendship with Stewie is the other emotional center of his life, and we will explore that relationship in detail when we get to Stewie. But for now, it is enough to say that the Brian and Stewie dynamic is the most emotionally developed relationship in the show's entire run. Two characters who should have nothing in common: an intellectually pretentious dog with unresolved abandonment issues and a genius baby with a complicated relationship to his own capacity for violence. Finding in each other the specific kind of friendship that asks for nothing and accepts everything. Brian drives a Prius because he is environmentally conscious. He is an atheist who engages frequently and sometimes patronizingly with the religious beliefs of people around him. He has been a drug-sniffing dog for the police and developed a cocaine habit during that period, later going through rehabilitation. He has worked at a newspaper. He has worked briefly as a stand-up comedian. He has been a kept man, a soldier. Stewie signed them both up for the military in one episode without Brian's knowledge, and at one point a celebrity chef on a cable cooking program that did not last. He died in the 12th season, hit by a car on the street in front of the Griffin house. The scene played out with unexpected gravity. His last words, spoken to the family gathered around him at the veterinary hospital, were, "You've given me a wonderful life. I love you all." The audience felt this. The show had earned that emotional moment through years of building a character with genuine depth. Brian's death trended on social media for days. National news outlets covered the story. Mila Kunis and Seth MacFarlane were asked about it in press interviews. And then, 2 episodes later, Stewie used time travel to go back and save him. The reversal is what stung. Not just because it undid the death, but because of what the undoing revealed. The show had not found the courage of its own storytelling. It had created a real emotional event, measured the audience's reaction, and then taken it back. The death of Brian Griffin was not a creative decision. It was a strategy, a temporary one. And the temporary nature of it said something about how the show understood its own characters, not as people who could grow and change and sometimes be lost, but as assets to be deployed and retrieved as the ratings required. He came back. He is still on the show. He still drinks too much and still struggles with the novel and still carries the quiet sadness of a person who wanted to be something great and has not quite managed it yet. And there is something about that persistence, his own and the show's, that feels appropriate for a character who is always fundamentally about the gap between aspiration and reality. Brian Griffin wanted to be taken seriously. He wanted to be seen. He wanted his work to matter and his opinions to land and his life to accumulate into something worth more than the sum of its wrong turns. He is, in many ways, the most human character in the show. Not because he is the most noble or the most self-aware, he is frequently neither, but because his struggle is recognizable. Because most of us know what it feels like to want more than we have achieved, and to keep going anyway, drinking slightly too much, and talking slightly too loudly about the things we wish we were better at, hoping nobody notices the gap. Brian's relationship with alcohol is one of the most consistent character threads in the show's run. He drinks martinis. He has a habit of pouring himself something strong in the early evening and continuing through the night. The drinking is not played primarily as a character flaw in the early seasons. It is simply part of who he is, the way certain people use a drink to smooth the transitions between the different parts of their day. But the show is also never entirely neutral about it. The connection between Brian's drinking and his inability to finish things, his novel, his college degree, his relationships, is present even when it is not stated. He discovered in a later season episode about sobriety that when he stops drinking, he can actually write. He produces a complete manuscript during a period of abstinence. The clarity that comes with removing alcohol from his routine turns out to be the missing ingredient in the creative process he has been struggling with for years. He then starts drinking again. This is a remarkably honest thing for the show to do with this character. The problem was identified. The solution was applied. The solution worked. And then the solution was abandoned because the habits of a lifetime are stronger than the clarity of a single sober period. And the dog who wanted to be a serious writer is not yet the person who can maintain the sustained discipline that serious writing requires. Whether he will ever become that person is left genuinely open. His relationship with Stewie has an arc that the show built across many seasons, and that represents the most emotionally developed relationship in the entire series. When Brian first encounters Stewie in the early episodes, their dynamic is primarily one of an adult humoring a child. Brian engages with Stewie's grand plans and elaborate speeches with the mixture of genuine amusement and mild concern that you might have for a very precocious, very strange child. He is one of the few characters who fully understands what Stewie is saying, and this understanding creates a bond that is unlike anything else in the show. Over time, this bond deepened into something more mutual. Brian needed Stewie as much as Stewie needed Brian. Brian needed someone who took him seriously at the level of his actual intelligence, which is quite high even if it falls short of his own estimation of it. Stewie provided that. Brian provided Stewie with emotional continuity, a constant presence who was not his parents, who was not subject to the authority structure of the Griffin household, who could simply be present with him as an equal. The episode Brian and Stewie from Season 8 is the fullest expression of this relationship, and it deserves more than the brief mention it has received so far. Brian reveals in this episode that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box. The reason he keeps the gun is that he has thought about ending his life. He keeps it there rather than at home because the physical distance between himself and the weapon is the thing that keeps the thought from becoming an action. The show handles this with more care than you would expect from a program that regularly uses a baby threatening to murder his mother as a running gag. Brian's revelation is not played for laughs. It is played with the specific gravity it deserves, and Stewie's response, which is to tell Brian, without hedging, how much he matters to him, is one of the most direct expressions of love the show has ever committed to. Brian's celebrity episode appearances constitute their own kind of extended character study. He has interacted with James Woods, who became his nemesis through the television script storyline. He has met and briefly worked alongside various real-world literary and cultural figures who appear in the show's universe. He has attended literary events, media galas, and cultural functions that a working-class family like the Griffins would not typically access. His specific existence as an educated, culturally engaged dog gives him a pass into social worlds that most of the other characters cannot enter. This is one of the show's more interesting pieces of world building. Brian Griffin occupies a genuinely strange social position. He is the family dog, technically. He is also a member of Mensa. He has been invited to write for The New Yorker. He attended an Ivy League university. He can speak French and Tagalog. He drives his own car. He pays for his own drinks at parties. He dates human women and has human friendships. The show never quite explains this status or decides what rules apply to it, because fully committing to either possibility, he is a dog, he is a person, would limit the kinds of stories you could tell about him. Instead, Brian exists in the ambiguous middle, and the ambiguity is itself part of the joke and part of the character. The episode Road to Rhode Island from the second season contains a sequence that is one of the most beautiful and strange pieces of storytelling in the show's early run. During their cross-country journey, Brian and Stewie stop at the farm in Texas where Brian was born. His mother, Biscuit, now very old, is still there. And there in the background, serving as a decorative element in the farmhouse living room, is a taxidermied version of his mother. Someone has had her mounted. Brian stands in front of the taxidermy, and the episode lets the moment breathe. It does not play it for big laughs. It does not resolve it neatly. It simply shows you a character confronting the specific, strange, particular grief of losing something in a way that leaves you nowhere to put the feeling. This is the version of Brian Griffin who deserves to be remembered. Not the arrogant political broadcaster of the later seasons. Not the character who became a vehicle for the writers to express opinions they were too cautious to attach to the human characters. The Brian who stood in front of his mother's taxidermied body and felt what there was to feel, and then kept going. Section 5. Stewie Griffin, the most dangerous person in this story. Let us be honest about what Stewie Griffin is. He is 1 year old. He sits in a high chair. He needs his diaper changed on a regular schedule. His mother carries him on her hip and sings to him and feeds him apple slices. He has plush toys in his crib. He has a favorite stuffed bear named Rupert. He also has a neutron bomb, 3 separate laser weapons, a working time machine, a multiverse transportation device, a weather control apparatus, and a detailed set of plans to assassinate his mother and establish himself as the ruler of all human civilization. Stuart Gilligan Griffin is the youngest child of Peter and Lois Griffin, and the show's description of where he came from and what he has been planning since before he was born is one of the more audaciously strange pieces of character mythology in the show's run. In the episode Chitty Chitty Death Bang from the first season, it is revealed that when Stewie was born, the delivery room doctor found a map of Europe inside Lois. A map. Inside an infant, with plans to bomb European capitals marked on it. Stewie had been developing his strategic infrastructure before he was even outside his mother's body. His 9 months in the womb are described, in his own words, as his time in what he calls his ovarian Bastille. He was not a prisoner of the womb. He was working in it. His voice is based on Rex Harrison's performance in the 1964 musical film My Fair Lady. Seth MacFarlane has described Stewie as an evil Rex Harrison, which is such a specific, confident, absolutely correct creative decision that it bears pausing on. There is something about the particular quality of that voice, polished, clipped, simultaneously enthusiastic and contemptuous, that perfectly captures what Stewie is. He sounds like someone who has read everything and decided that most of it was beneath him, and who is trying very hard to contain his boredom while the world catches up. In the first season, Stewie's characterization is remarkably consistent. He wants 2 things. He wants to kill Lois, whom he blames for the 9 months of confinement she inflicted on him without his consent. And he wants world domination, which he approaches with the methodical patience of a chess grandmaster who happens to be in a diaper. Every episode in the first season has at least one scene in which Stewie is either actively trying to harm Lois, building something that will eventually be used to harm Lois, or delivering a monologue about his plans to harm Lois while the person he is delivering the monologue to either ignores him or does not fully process what he's saying. This is the central dramatic irony of early Stewie. The audience can hear everything he says. The characters around him mostly cannot. When Stewie tells Brian that he has redesigned his laser cannon to address the issue of thermal dissipation in the focusing chamber, Brian sometimes acknowledges this and sometimes does not, depending on the episode. When Stewie tells Lois that he is going to enjoy watching her suffer, Lois says, "Oh, Stewie, you are so adorable," and kisses him on the head. The gap between what Stewie is saying and how people are responding to it is where most of his comedy lives in those early seasons. The weapons he builds are extraordinary. He has constructed advanced fighter jets from materials available in his bedroom. He has built a shrinking pod, a teleportation device, a cloning machine, a mind control device, a weather control apparatus, and a working transporter that functions exactly like the one from Star Trek, which he occasionally uses simply because it is convenient. The sophistication of the technology he produces is at a level that would require teams of scientists working over decades, and he does it alone in a nursery between naps and feedings, which says something interesting about how he uses the limited window of quiet time available to him. His relationship with his bear Rupert deserves specific attention because it is one of the most consistent character details in the entire show. Rupert is a stuffed bear. He does not talk, he does not move. He is, by every physical measure, an inanimate object. Stewie treats him as a confidant, an advisor, a companion, and a witness to his plans. He tells Rupert things he does not tell Brian. He asks Rupert for his opinion. He discusses Rupert's feelings with the same seriousness he brings to everything else. In one episode, Brian destroys Rupert while drunk, chewing the bear to pieces out of irritation. The scene plays as comedy, but Stewie's response to losing Rupert is one of the more emotionally raw moments the character has ever been given. He does not rage. He grieves. Quietly, with the specific dignity of someone who has lost something that was only valuable to them, and who understands that no one else will understand why it hurts. Stewie's time machine first appears in the season 1 episode Mind Over Murder, where Stewie originally builds it to skip past teething pain. He constructs a device to accelerate himself through time, arrives a few days in the future, discovers that people have copied his plans, and rewinds everything back to the beginning. This sets the template. The time machine is a utility. It solves problems. It creates new problems. It allows the show to take its characters anywhere in history or forward into futures that may or may not be real. The most significant time travel storyline involving Stewie is Road to Germany from the 7th season, in which Mort Goldman, the neurotic Jewish pharmacist who lives in the neighborhood, accidentally stumbles into Stewie's time machine and ends up in 1939 Germany. Stewie and Brian follow him, and the three of them spend the episode navigating Nazi-occupied Europe, needing to acquire uranium to power their return trip, and doing so by having Stewie impersonate Hitler at a Nazi rally. The episode plays its premise for comedy bus, as you would expect, but it is also one of the most genuinely tense things the show ever did. Being chased by the Third Reich is not a low-stakes situation, and the episode does not pretend otherwise. But the most cosmologically significant time travel event in Stewie's history comes in the Season 9 episode The Big Bang Theory. And the lore here goes very deep, so let us slow down and follow it carefully. Stewie's nemesis throughout the middle seasons is a character named Bertram. Bertram is technically Stewie's half-brother, conceived from the same paternal genetic material at a different time, through Peter's history of sperm donation. Bertram is everything Stewie is: intelligent, driven, focused, but directed entirely toward destruction rather than domination. He is not interested in ruling the world. He is interested in ending the world, or at least ending Stewie. In The Big Bang Theory, Bertram discovers that Stewie has a functioning time machine and conceives a plan to eliminate Stewie from history entirely. To do this, he travels back to the late 15th century with the intention of killing Stewie's ancestor, thus preventing Stewie from ever being born. The ancestor in question, Stewie eventually determines, is Leonardo da Vinci. Here is where the lore becomes genuinely strange. Stewie and Brian pursue Bertram into the past, and the situation rapidly escalates from a family conflict into a universe-ending paradox. Because Stewie's existence is necessary for something much larger than anyone initially realized. The reason that Stewie must not be erased from history is that Stewie is the one who will eventually cause the Big Bang. The entire universe, every galaxy, every star, every atom of matter, exists because Stewie Griffin, at some point in the cosmological future, will be directly responsible for its creation. This means, if you follow the logic of the episode to its conclusion, that every event in the show, every character, every story, every moment of comedy and heartbreak and absurdity, all of it exists because a baby in a diaper is eventually going to create the universe. The universe that Stewie currently inhabits was made by Stewie himself. He is his own cosmological origin point. He is the most important being in existence, not because of what he has done, but because of what he will do. He resolves the Bertram situation as it happens by injecting his own DNA into Leonardo da Vinci's girlfriend, effectively making himself his own ancestor. He then returns to the present, having saved the universe, and brings Brian back a souvenir from the past. Brian wanted one of Leonardo's original notebooks. Stewie brings him a candle. This is who Stewie Griffin is. He saved all of existence. He brought someone a candle. The evolution of Stewie across the show's run is one of the central creative arcs of the whole series, and it went in a direction that still divides people who watched the show. The evil genius baby of the first 3 seasons slowly transformed, starting around the 4th season, into something softer and more emotionally accessible. The world domination plots became less frequent. The attempts on Lois's life faded into the background. The weapons were still there, but they were used less often for murder and more often for adventure. Stewie became Brian's travel companion, then his closest friend, then the person who defined Brian's emotional landscape more than anyone else. By the sixth season, the show produced a two-part story called Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie, which reads, in retrospect, as a farewell to the original version of the character. In the first episode, Stewie finally succeeds. He actually kills Lois. She dies. The world changes. The world. Stewie seizes power, because of course he does, and begins reshaping global civilization according to his own specifications. In the second episode, Lois turns out to be alive. She survived in the ocean for a year, and comes for him. What follows is essentially the final confrontation between everything Stewie was in seasons 1 through 3 and everything the show was about to turn him into. It is dramatic and funny and genuinely exciting. And then the twist. It was all a simulation running on Stewie's computer. A hypothetical he had been running, exploring what would actually happen if he did what he had always said he wanted to do. None of it was real. Everything reset. Stewie goes back to being, as the show would increasingly define him, something more like a complicated, emotionally rich child with unusual capabilities than the singular, terrifying genius villain he was at the beginning. Whether this evolution is a loss or a gain depends on what you value in the character. The show gained tremendous emotional depth from the softer Stewie. His friendship with Brian produced some of the most genuinely moving television the series ever created. The Road to Episodes, a series of adventure specials featuring Brian and Stewie traveling together, named as a homage to the Bing Crosby and Bob Hope road to comedy films of the 1940s, are consistently cited by fans as the show's finest work, and they required a Stewie who is capable of warmth, vulnerability, and loyalty. But the evil baby was one of a kind. There has never been another character quite like early Stewie Griffin, and the show walked away from him before it had to. Let us slow down and spend more time inside Stewie's psychology, because it is one of the more interesting character constructions in animated television and it rewards careful attention. Stewie's stated grievance against Lois is that she confined him in the womb for 9 months without his consent. He describes his time there as imprisonment, but the show gestures occasionally toward a more complicated reading. His matricidal impulses are not purely logical responses to a specific grievance. They seem to be the externalized expression of something deeper, a refusal to accept dependence, a hatred of vulnerability, a need to destroy the source of the care that he cannot acknowledge needing without feeling weakened by the acknowledgement. This reading gains support from the way Stewie responds when Lois is genuinely kind to him. He is not unmoved by her tenderness. There are moments when she holds him or speaks to him with genuine warmth, and something in him visibly softens before he catches himself and reasserts his antagonism. The episode Stewie Loves Lois from the 5th season explores this directly. Stewie has a period in the episode where he becomes genuinely attached to Lois, seeking her attention and affection with an intensity that makes him uncomfortable when he reflects on it. The episode uses this shift to suggest that the hatred and the love coexist in him, that his desire to destroy Lois is inseparable from the enormous need he has for her that he cannot bear to acknowledge. This is good character writing. Not all of it was intentional in those early seasons. Some of it was the show discovering its characters by playing with them. But the result is a psychological portrait that holds together in interesting ways. Stewie wants to kill his mother because he needs her, and he cannot live with needing her, and the only way to resolve the unbearable tension between the need and the inability to admit it is to eliminate the source of the need entirely. He never succeeds, and this failure, repeated across season after season, is not simply a mechanical property of the show's status quo preserving structure. It is also, on some level, the story of a character who wants to destroy the thing he loves, and keeps not being able to do it. Which is a more interesting story than it initially appears to be. His relationship with Rupert, his stuffed bear, deserves extended attention because it is one of the most consistently rendered character details in the show's entire run, and because it reveals something important about who Stewie is underneath the schemes and the villainy. Rupert is not sentient. Stewie knows this, but Stewie treats Rupert with the emotional attentiveness that he is unable or unwilling to extend to actual people. He tells Rupert about his plans. He consults Rupert when he is uncertain. He shares his fears with Rupert in the quiet moments before sleep. In one episode, he describes Rupert to someone else as his only true confidant, which is both funny and quietly devastating. The most sophisticated infant genius in the history of animation saves his most authentic emotional engagement for a stuffed animal. What Rupert represents is safety. The bear asks for nothing, judges nothing, and maintains perfect confidentiality. Stewie can tell Rupert that he is afraid or lonely or confused, and the information stays contained within that relationship. He cannot say these things to Brian, or rather he can and eventually does in the Brian and Stewie episode. But doing so with Brian costs something. It creates vulnerability and intimacy and the possibility of loss. Rupert cannot leave. Rupert cannot die. Until the episode where Brian destroys Rupert, which changes Stewie's relationship to loss in a way that the show never fully explores, but that is there in the texture of his behavior afterward. The hardware of Stewie's intelligence is genuinely extraordinary in the terms the show has established. He does not just build things. He builds things that should require decades of research and billions in resources. And he builds them alone in a nursery, using materials he can access from within the context of being a baby in a suburban household. The Time Machine is the most famous of his creations, but it is far from the most impressive. His multiverse transporter was built without reference to prior work in the field, because no prior work in the field existed. He invented the technology from first principles. He also built a teleporter modeled on the Star Trek transporter, a functioning weather control device, multiple autonomous robotic systems, a shrinking pod, and advanced weapons including laser systems and rocket launchers. The question of where he acquired his education is genuinely unanswered by the show. He references academic disciplines with specificity. He knows physics and chemistry and engineering and computer science and history and literature. But the show has never explained how a baby who has never attended school and who spends most of his time in a crib came to possess this knowledge. One implication suggested by the cosmological lore we explored earlier is that his intelligence is not simply genetic, but cosmological in origin. He is the being who will eventually create the universe. The knowledge might be intrinsic to what he is rather than acquired through conventional education. He might simply know things because knowing them is part of his fundamental mental nature. In Season 9, there is an episode called The Hand That Rocks the Wheelchair, in which Stewie becomes concerned that he has lost his edge. He feels that he has become too soft, too gentle, too far from the evil genius he was designed to be. He builds a machine intended to amplify his evil traits. Instead of amplifying his own evil, the machine accidentally creates a clone of him. A clone that contains all of his evil concentrated into a separate being, while the original Stewie is left with whatever remains. The episode is partly a meta-commentary on the show's own transformation of the character, acknowledging that the evil genius has been extracted from the version of Stewie who currently exists and placed somewhere else. Separate, no longer integrated into the person we see every week. The evil clone, eventually named Iwetz, is essentially what early Stewie would have become if the show had continued in the original direction. He is malicious in a way that the current Stewie is not. He does not hesitate. He does not feel affection or warmth or the pull of friendship. He simply acts on his darkest impulses without the counterweight that the current Stewie has developed. The episode ends with Brian shooting one of the twins, not being sure which one he has killed, and then the surviving Stewie turning to the camera with glowing yellow eyes, a reference to the end of Michael Jackson's Thriller, before the episode cuts to black. The implication is left unresolved. Whether the Stewie who currently exists in the show is the original or the evil clone is a question the writers planted and then declined to answer. It remains one of the more interesting pieces of ambiguous lore in the show's history. If the current Stewie is the evil clone, then his genuine warmth and his care for Brian and his capacity for love are all the more remarkable. They suggest that evil, when given enough time and the right relationships, can develop into something more complicated. If the current Stewie is the original, then the story is simpler. The gentler version always existed inside the villain, waiting for the conditions that would allow it to emerge. Either way, Stewie Griffin is the most interesting character in the show. He is the most original. He is the one whose story, taken from beginning to wherever it eventually ends, has the most to say about the relationship between intelligence and violence, ambition and love, the grandiosity of our plans and the smallness of the moments that actually matter to us. He sits in his nursery at night. He talks to Rupert about his plans. He watches the house through the baby monitor while everyone else is asleep. And somewhere in the machinery of his enormous mind, the universe is still waiting to be born. Section 6. Meg Griffin, the one who sees everything. There is a theory about Meg Griffin that circulates among people who think carefully about the show, and it goes like this. Meg Griffin is the only member of her family who is actually paying attention. She sees her father for what he is. She sees her mother's compromises. She sees the dysfunction clearly, without the buffer of obliviousness that protects everyone else in the household from understanding what their life actually looks like. And she is the one who suffers most for it. This is not the show's conscious intention, at least not in the later seasons when Meg's treatment becomes most extreme. But it is what the character suggests if you look at her as something more than a punchline. Meg was originally voiced in the pilot by an actress named Lacey Chabert. Starting from season 2, Mila Kunis took over the role and has voiced Meg ever since. In those earliest episodes, Meg Griffin is recognizable as a specific type of teenage girl. She is unpopular. She is earnest in ways that her peers do not reward. She is trying, sincerely and continuously, to be liked, to fit in, to find the place where she belongs. And the world keeps declining to offer her that place. She is not unintelligent. She is not cruel. She is not remarkable in any direction that the show initially chooses to highlight. She is just a girl in a family full of people who cannot see her, trying to be seen. The pilot gave her her own storyline. Her early season episodes gave her genuine character moments. The episode Barely Legal from season 5 is one of the better examples of what Meg can be when the writing takes her seriously. She develops a crush on Brian after he takes her to the prom out of pity. The episode handles her feelings with more care than you might expect, acknowledging both the genuine pain of unrequited feeling and the complicated dignity of having those feelings at all. Brian handles the situation imperfectly, as Brian tends to handle most situations, but the episode does not use Meg's emotions as pure comedy fodder. It treats them as real. Her full name is Megan Griffin. She was born before Stewie's twin, Dave Griffin, who was killed in utero when Stewie, finding the presence of another baby in the womb intolerable, suffocated him before birth. Meg has a social security number. She is enrolled in James Woods Regional High School. She has at various points been accepted into college, won athletic competitions, demonstrated artistic talent, shown genuine intellectual capability, and displayed an emotional resilience that most of the other characters in the show do not possess. None of this is consistently acknowledged by the show. The cruelty that Meg absorbs across the seasons is well documented, and there are genuinely troubling episodes in the show's middle run that turn her mistreatment into extended comedy set pieces. But what is less often noted is the moments when the show circles back to take Meg seriously, and what those moments reveal about who she actually is. The Simpsons crossover episode, The Simpsons Guy from season 13, pairs Meg with Lisa Simpson in one of the more interesting character pairing decisions the episode makes. Lisa encounters Meg and recognizes something in her, a girl who is being systematically overlooked, whose genuine qualities are invisible to the people who should most clearly see them. Lisa encourages Meg. She tells her she has talent. She helps her discover that she has a gift for playing the saxophone. It is a warm episode moment and a real one, and it demonstrates that the show knows exactly who Meg is when it chooses to pay attention. The episode Peter's Sister from season 14 tries to explain the cycle of cruelty that Meg inhabits. It reveals that Peter was physically and emotionally abused by his own sister growing up, and that the way he treats Meg is a direct transmission of that abuse. The pattern of a person who is hurt, turning that hurt toward the next vulnerable person in the chain. Meg understands this. The episode ends with her showing Peter genuine compassion, acknowledging the history that created the behavior even while knowing what that behavior has cost her. Peter cries. They embrace. It is a genuinely emotional moment. And the following episode goes right back to business as usual. This is the core disappointment of Meg's arc. Not that she is mistreated. She is, and it is uncomfortable, but that the show repeatedly gives her the tools for change and then refuses to let change happen. It demonstrates that Peter can recognize his own damage, and that Meg can extend grace and that something real can pass between them. And then it takes it back. Every time. The reset button hits and the lesson does not stick, and Meg goes back to being the person everyone piles on without consequence. There is something in Meg Griffin that the show cannot quite decide what to do with. She is too sympathetic to be purely comedic, but the show kept trying to use her that way. She is too intelligent to be the butt of every joke, but the jokes kept coming. She is too resilient to be a victim, but the framing kept putting her in that position. The show was most interesting when it could not figure out how to categorize her because in those moments it let her just be a person, complicated, aware, more capable than the room gives her credit for. What Meg represents, at her best, is the specific experience of being a teenage girl who sees clearly and is rewarded for seeing clearly with invisibility. The family needs her to be the target because if she stops being the target, everyone else has to look at themselves. This is literally the premise of the controversial Season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party, where Meg's breakdown and subsequent confrontation with her family temporarily causes the Griffins to turn on each other. And the episode resolves by having Meg agree to go back to being everyone's emotional receptacle because otherwise the family cannot function. The episode is deeply uncomfortable, but it is also, in its uncomfortable way, one of the most honest things the show ever said about certain kinds of family dynamics. Some families need a designated person to absorb their collective dysfunction. The person in that role is almost never the one with the most power. And the decision to stay in that role is never as straightforward as it looks from outside because family is not just a source of harm. It is also, even when broken, a source of connection that is very hard to simply walk away from. Meg's story is not finished. She is still in the house on Spooner Street. She still goes to school. She still tries to be seen, and in the later seasons, as more women joined the writing staff and the explicit cruelty toward her character gradually decreased, she began to get episodes that showed something different. A girl who was tough. A girl who could fight back. A girl who knew what she had survived and was not asking for credit for it. That Meg was always in there. It just took a long time for the show to decide she was worth finding. Meg's story has an additional dimension that is easy to miss because the show rarely foregrounds it directly, but which surfaces in episodes scattered across the full run. Meg is, objectively, the Griffin family member who has had the most genuinely difficult life within the show's internal reality. And she is also the one who has developed the most genuine resilience as a result of that difficulty. The things that have been done to her and the ways she has managed to keep functioning in spite of them speak to a specific kind of toughness. Not the loud, performative toughness of a character who has never been truly tested, but the quiet toughness of someone who has learned, through sustained experience, how to absorb damage without being destroyed by it. She has held boissonades. She has had relationships, some genuine and some not. She has won academic distinctions that the family fails to acknowledge. She played the saxophone with enough ability that Lisa Simpson was impressed. She has a capacity for friendship that the show rarely lets her fully exercise because maintaining the dynamic requires that she remain relatively isolated. But the capacity is there. In episodes where the show gives her the space to connect with another character genuinely, she is warm and observant and funny in a dry, self-aware way that comes from spending years as the person in the room that no one fully sees. There is a character detail that surfaces in a few episodes and is never made central. Meg is the only member of the Griffin family who seems to actually like their town. Peter tolerates it. Lois has a complicated relationship with having chosen a middle-class life in a middle-class place. Brian wants to be somewhere more culturally significant. Stewie is always planning to be somewhere else entirely. But Meg grew up there, in that specific neighborhood on that specific street. And she knows the town in the particular way you know. A place that has been the backdrop of your entire existence. She knows which diner has the best food. She knows the shortcuts between neighborhoods. She knows the names of people who are background characters to everyone else. This familiarity is something the show could have used more effectively to develop her as a character grounded in a specific place in the way that the early Peter was grounded in his. It occasionally gestures toward this. There are episodes where her knowledge of the neighborhood or the social landscape becomes temporarily relevant, but never quite commits to making her the character who knows the most about the world she inhabits, which she could have been. Her exit from the show when she eventually went to college was handled with characteristic economy. The Griffin household rearranged itself in her absence. Stewie converted her room into a gym, and when she came back, things more or less returned to the previous configuration, which the show presents as natural and unremarkable, as if the departure and return of the family's oldest child are events of no particular significance. Which tells you something about how the show sees her even in its kinder periods. She is absent. She is present. The difference does not register as significantly as it should. This is the persistent sadness of Meg Griffin. Not that she is mistreated, though she is, and not that she is overlooked, though she is, but that even the version of the show that handles her more carefully still fails to fully reckon with how interesting she is. She is the most psychologically realistic character in the Griffin household, the one whose responses to her circumstances are most proportionate and most human. And the show keeps treating her as a supporting player in her own story. She deserves better. And on the rare occasions when the show remembers that, she gets it. And those moments are among the most genuinely good things the show has ever made. Section 7. Brian and Stewie on the Road. The show's greatest adventure serial. There is a format that Family Guy discovered somewhere around the 4th season and then kept returning to for good reason, because it reliably produced some of the finest work the show ever made. The Road to Episodes. Specials built around Brian and Stewie traveling together, named as a deliberate homage to the Bing Crosby and Bob Hope Road to Comedy films from the 1940s. These films, Road to Singapore, Road to Zanzibar, Road to Morocco, Road to Rio, and several others, featured the two stars as friends who wandered into comic misadventures in exotic locations, punctuating the action with musical numbers and fourth wall breaks, and the specific chemistry of two very different people who genuinely liked each other. Brian and Stewie are the spiritual descendants of that tradition, and the Road to Episodes built around them represent the apex of what Family Guy could accomplish as a storytelling format. The first of the major Road to Adventures is Road to Rhode Island, from the 2nd season, which sends Brian and Stewie on a cross-country journey after they get stranded far from home. The episode establishes the template. Stewie provides the competence and the planning. Brian provides the perspective and the dry commentary. They bicker in the way that people bicker when they know each other well enough to know exactly which buttons to push. They also, in the moments between the bickering, show a genuine tenderness toward each other that the show handles with surprising lightness. The emotional content does not overwhelm the comedy, but it is always present, giving the adventure actual stakes in the form of a friendship that means something to both of them. Road to Germany, from the 7th season, is the darkest of the Road to specials and the one that pushes the format furthest. It begins with Mort Goldman accidentally stumbling into Stewie's time machine and ending up in 1939 Germany. Stewie and Brian have to follow him, navigate the Third Reich, and find a way back to the present. The episode was written with real care about its subject matter. The horror of the historical setting is not softened for comfort. Nazi Germany in this episode is genuinely dangerous, and the stakes of the characters failing are genuinely high. It remains one of the few Family Guy episodes that can be called legitimately dramatic without any qualification. A piece of television that is funny and also frightening and also, in its conclusion, quietly moving. Road to the Multiverse from the 8th season is arguably the peak of the format. It begins at a county fair where Stewie shows Brian a pig he has brought back from a parallel universe using a device he has built that allows him to travel between dimensions. Brian insists on seeing this device used. Stewie agrees, and the two of them begin jumping from universe to universe, each one presenting a different version of their world. A universe where Christianity never existed, and humanity is therefore 1,000 years more technologically advanced. A universe that operates according to the rules of a Flintstones cartoon. A universe rendered in early Disney animation style, where the town's Jewish resident, Mort Goldman, is subjected to violence by animated woodland creatures in a clear allusion to Walt Disney's well-documented anti-Semitism. A universe where the United States lost World War II and Japan won, rendering everything in a Japanese animation aesthetic. A universe that appears to be a low-resolution computer game. A universe consisting of only a single frame. The episode was written by Wellesley Wild and directed by Greg Colton, who won a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Individual Achievement in Animation for his storyboarding work on it. Seth MacFarlane, in a 2012 interview, named it as among the best episodes the show had ever produced. It drew over 10 million viewers when it aired, which at that point in the show's run was a significant audience. The multiverse premise, which would later become one of the most overused concepts in all of popular entertainment, felt genuinely fresh and inventive here, and the execution honored both the concept and the characters. Road to the North Pole from the 9th season is the most emotionally complex of the Road to specials. It is a Christmas episode, and it begins with Stewie forming a deeply antagonistic relationship with the idea of Santa Claus, after being dismissed at a mall Santa meeting. He decides that he wants to find the North Pole and confront Santa personally. Brian accompanies him. What they find there is nothing like the fantasy. The North Pole in this episode is not a magical workshop. It is an exhausted, underfunded operation, staffed by inbred elves who have been stretched past their breaking point by the impossible demands of modern gift-giving culture. Santa himself is sick, physically deteriorating under the weight of what billions of children expect from him every year. The episode turns into something genuinely dark. Brian and Stewie end up having to deliver gifts themselves, city by city, country by country, and the experience destroys them over a sequence that is simultaneously one of the funniest and most disturbing things the show ever depicted. By the end of the episode, they have flown around the entire globe and delivered every gift and are barely alive, and the conclusion is that Christmas is a sustainable fantasy, only if no one looks at the machinery behind it too carefully. Road to the Pilot, from the 10th season, takes Brian and Stewie back to the show's own first episode using Stewie's time machine, allowing the characters to meet earlier versions of themselves and observe the family as they were in 1999. The episode is primarily a meditation on how much the show has changed, and it is self-aware about this in ways that are both funny and a little melancholy. Brian from the present can see how different the early seasons were. He can see the warmth that existed in the family's early dynamic, the rougher animation that gave the show a different kind of energy, the version of the characters that existed before certain changes took hold. The episode ends with catastrophic changes to the timeline that require Stewie to make multiple trips back to fix, each correction making things worse, until they finally settle on the version of history that matches the show's present, which the episode implies is not necessarily the best possible outcome, just the one they are stuck with. Road to Vegas, from the 11th season, is the smallest in scale of the Road to specials, and perhaps the most purely funny. Stewie builds a teleportation device and accidentally creates a duplicate of both himself and Brian, sending one version of each to Las Vegas while the originals stay home. The two pairs of versions then have very different experiences of the same trip, with the lucky versions living extravagantly and the unlucky versions being pursued by loan sharks through a series of escalating misadventures. The episode ends with the unlucky versions agreeing to a suicide pact to avoid their pursuers, which resolves when the lucky versions intervene at the last moment. It is a lighter episode than most of the Road to specials, but very well executed. A demonstration that the format works just as well on a small canvas as on a large one. What all of these episodes have in common is the relationship at their center. Brian and Stewie together are genuinely one of the great odd couple pairings in animated television, and the Road to episodes know how to use that pairing. They are different enough to generate constant conflict, similar enough in their intelligence to have real conversations, and close enough to each other that the stakes of their adventures extend beyond survival and into the question of what this friendship means to each of them. The episode Brian and Stewie from the 8th season, not a road to episode, but the emotional companion piece to all of them, locks the two characters alone in a bank vault overnight with no cutaways and no external plot and nothing but each other's company. Brian reveals he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box because he has thought about ending his own life. Stewie reveals how much Brian means to him in terms so direct they could not be mistaken for anything but love. The word used plainly and without qualification. Not romantic love, but the deep, particular love between two people who have seen each other at their worst and chosen to stay. That episode is perhaps the finest piece of television Family Guy ever produced. No cutaways, no random gags, just two characters in a room, talking honestly. It proves everything the Road to Episodes prove, that when this show is willing to commit to its own characters and give them real stakes and real emotional content, it is capable of something extraordinary. There are additional Road to Episodes worth examining in their full texture, because each one adds something distinctive to the overall body of work. Road to Rupert, from the 5th season, is less cosmologically ambitious than later entries in the series, but more emotionally focused. Stewie's beloved bear Rupert is accidentally sold at a garage sale while Stewie is distracted, and Stewie enlists Brian to help him track down and recover Rupert. The episode is essentially a road movie built around the retrieval of a stuffed animal, which sounds slight, but plays with genuine warmth because the show understands exactly why Rupert matters to Stewie and never makes the mistake of treating his attachment to the bear as a joke rather than a character truth. The journey takes them across multiple states. They encounter obstacles. They work as a team. And by the end, the friendship has been deepened by the shared mission in ways that later episodes will build on. Road to Germany, which we have already discussed in detail, stands apart from the other Road to Episodes because its tonal register is genuinely different. It is the only entry in the series that is primarily an adventure thriller rather than a comedy adventure. The comedy is there, but it exists in the interstices of a story that takes its stakes seriously. Being in Nazi Germany is not played primarily for laughs. The danger is real. The history is real. And the episode's willingness to engage with that historical weight without either trivializing it or losing the character dynamics that make the format work is one of the most sophisticated things the show ever attempted. Road to the North Pole, which ran in 2 parts as a Christmas special, is the entry in the series that most fully develops the emotional complexity of the Brian and Stewie relationship. It begins with a simple premise: Stewie wants to confront Santa, and ends somewhere considerably darker and more honest about the nature of the Christmas mythology and what it costs to maintain it. The sequence in which Brian and Stewie attempt to deliver all the world's Christmas presents themselves, over a single night, breaking down physically and psychologically in the process, is one of the most sustained pieces of dark comedy the show ever produced. By the time they reach the end of their route, they are barely functional. They have seen things, they have done things. They are not the same as when they started, and the episode is honest about the fact that some of the damage is not going to simply repair itself when they get home. The episode ends with the reestablishment of the Christmas myth. Santa recovers, the world gets its gifts, the fiction continues. But it is the fiction that has been established as a fiction. Brian and Stewie have seen the machinery. They know what is behind the curtain, and the episode trusts the audience to sit with that knowledge rather than paper it over. What makes all of these episodes work, beyond the individual qualities of each, is the consistency of the central relationship. Brian and Stewie in every Road to episode are recognizably the same. Brian and Stewie we know from the main show, Tamano. They have the same dynamic, the same rhythms, the same history. But the Road to format strips away the other characters and the cutaway gag structure and everything else that can obscure the relationship in regular episodes, and lets us see them as they actually are. 2 very different beings who have found in each other the specific companionship that neither of them could have predicted they needed. Brian needed someone who took his intelligence seriously without requiring him to perform it. Stewie needed someone who could hold his darkness without being destroyed by it. They both found what they needed, and the Road to episodes are the cleanest expression of what that looks like when it is working. Section 8. The town and its strangest residents. The town that the Griffins live in has a population of approximately 800 people, according to one episode's brief display of a civic census sign, which, given the sheer density of significant characters the show has produced over 25 seasons, suggests either that the census was significantly undercount, or that this particular stretch of Rhode Island produces more memorable individuals per square mile than anywhere else on Earth. The neighbors on Spooner Street alone constitute a remarkable collection of individuals. Joe Swanson lives at 33 Spooner Street with his wife Bonnie and their daughter Susie and, in later seasons, their son Kevin. Joe was a police officer, paralyzed from the waist down after an encounter with a criminal on a rooftop on Christmas Eve. He was chasing a man known as the Grinch, not the fictional character, an actual criminal who had adopted the seasonal persona, and the confrontation resulted in his injury. This backstory was revised in a later episode to involve a different origin entirely, because the show's continuity is, to put it diplomatically, flexible. But the spirit of the character remained consistent across revisions. A man of enormous physical confidence and genuine capability, who happens to use a wheelchair, and whose disability the show sometimes handles with dignity and sometimes uses as a punchline, depending on the episode. Joe in the first season is a genuinely compelling figure. The episode A Hero Sits Next Door, which introduces him, frames him as someone the entire neighborhood admires. Peter becomes jealous of Joe's popularity and has to work through that jealousy over the course of the episode. The early Joe is self-possessed, capable, and respected, which is exactly why Peter's reaction to him is so revealing. It says something real about the way certain kinds of men respond to being in the presence of someone who is genuinely accomplished in ways they are not. Bonnie Swanson, Joe's wife, was pregnant for what seemed like an impossibly long time on the show, a detail the writers eventually acknowledged by having the pregnancy come to its conclusion after years of in-show time had passed. She and Joe have a complicated relationship in the later seasons, as the show put more strain on their marriage, but their dynamic in the early years was functional and affectionate in a way that provided real contrast with Peter and Lois's more chaotic partnership. Glenn the pilot lives at 29 Spooner Street. His full name is Glenn Quagelchek. The surname Quagmire is not his birth name, but rather a legal name he adopted at some point before the show begins, a detail revealed in the episode Tiegs for Two. He was overweight as a child. He is half Polish. He is 61 years old according to a driver's license that appears briefly in one episode, though this does not square easily with multiple other age and timeline references the show has made. He is also described as making himself look younger by eating a lot of carrots, which seems like exactly the kind of detail that is just plausible enough to be funny. Glenn's voice was developed by Seth MacFarlane after listening to fast-talking radio pitchmen from the 1940s. The giggity catchphrase was inspired by a Jerry Lewis impression, performed by a writer on the show named Steve Marmol. His chin is one of the most distinctive visual elements in the show's character design. Aggressively forward-jutting, architecturally impossible, a cartoon landmark in the landscape of the neighborhood. He served in the Navy, where he met Peter Griffin. The two of them were friends before the show's timeline begins, and their long friendship is one of the show's few pieces of genuine continuity across its entire run. Glenn is, according to multiple characters in the show, not a good person. The litany of his transgressions is extensive and escalating, and occasionally genuinely difficult to laugh at. But the show has always maintained a complicated relationship with him, treating him as simultaneously the most irredeemably transgressive member of the friend group and the one capable of surprising acts of genuine loyalty and protectiveness toward the people he cares about. His relationship with his family is one of the show's more developed secondary character arcs. His father Dan turns out to be a transgender woman named Ida, revealed in the Season 9 episode Quagmire's Dad, which was one of the more controversial episodes of its era and one of the few that attempted to engage with questions of gender identity from a position of something approaching genuine complexity, even if the execution was uneven. His sister Brenda is the subject of the episode Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q, which deals directly and unusually seriously with domestic abuse. Glenn, discovering that Brenda's partner Jeff is hurting her, eventually kills Jeff to protect her. The episode is divisive. It plays its premise somewhat earnestly while still maintaining the show's broader comedic tone. But it reveals a Glenn who is capable of the kind of unconditional protective love that is hard to square with his more purely selfish behavior elsewhere. He has a daughter named Anna Lee, whom he puts up for adoption after discovering her existence in the episode Quagmire's Baby. The question of what it means to be a father versus what it means to be a biological progenitor hangs over that episode without being fully resolved. His past life, according to one episode, was Jack the Ripper. In a future timeline from Back to the Pilot following a nuclear war with a resurrected Confederacy, Glenn has mutated into a frog creature called Frogmire, until he is destroyed by a Terminator version of Joe Swanson. The facts of Glenn's existence extend in every direction, and most of them lead somewhere strange. Cleveland Brown deserves mention even though he departed Spooner Street to anchor his own spin-off show. Cleveland is the most contained, most consistent, most genuinely reliable member of Peter's friend group. and his departure changed the dynamic of the original quartet in ways that took the show a long time to fully absorb. He was steady in a way that his friends were not. His particular form of patience, the ability to process chaos around him without being destroyed by it, gave the group its emotional ballast, and, without him, the remaining three became a slightly less balanced unit. The Drunken Clam, where these four men have spent most of their adult lives sitting at a corner table drinking Pawtucket Patriot Ale and talking, is run by a man named Horace. Horace is not a significant character. He does not have much of an inner life as depicted in the show, but his bar has been the site of so many significant conversations and so many episodes worth of living that it has taken on a kind of sacred quality for longtime fans. When Peter and his friends sit down at their table at the Drunken Clam, there is something in that ritual that feels like continuity. Like here, at least, something stays the same. There is a retired man named Herbert who lives on Spooner Street and has a very dark characterization that the show handles with a mixture of horror and absurdist comedy. His dog is named Jesse. He moves slowly. He speaks slowly. He has an overt fixation on Chris Griffin that the show never addresses directly but never lets you forget. He is one of the show's most uncomfortable recurring presences, a character who exists in the space between joke and genuinely troubling, and the show never quite resolves which side of that line it wants him on. Adam West, the mayor, lives somewhere in this town. His presence in the show is one of the most delightful celebrity collaborations in animation history. The real Adam West, who passed away in 2017, voiced the character for 17 years. Mayor Adam West has the same first and last name as the actor because the character is essentially a version of the actor playing a heightened version of what someone might be if they were the real Adam West living in an animated city and also mayor of it. He governs with absolute conviction in a own judgment and almost no engagement with the actual requirements of governance. He once purchased a solid gold house shaped like himself because someone dared him to. He declared war on the moon. He believed he had a condition he called cat-like reflexes. He ate a lot of cereal. He was married to Carol Pewterschmidt, Lois's sister, which made him family. And when Adam West passed away in the real world, the show retired the mayor character rather than recast him, a decision that speaks to how thoroughly the character had become inseparable from the specific quality of that voice and that man's particular, irreplaceable presence. This town is full of people who exist in the space between mundane and impossible. Mort Goldman and his wife Muriel, Tom Tucker and his son Jake, Consuela, who cleans the Griffin house and refuses to be hurried about it, Ollie Williams at the local news desk, who communicates exclusively in brief, percussive statements delivered at maximum volume, Dr. Hartman, the family doctor whose casual incompetence has endangered the lives of his patients across multiple episodes without ever seeming to meaningfully affect his practice. They are a neighborhood. They are a community in the loose, overlapping, occasionally resentful way that communities actually form. And the town they inhabit is strange enough, layered enough, and lived in enough that it feels, if you spend enough time in it, like a real place. One that you probably would not want to move to, but one that you might find yourself thinking about at odd hours, wondering what is happening on Spooner Street right now. The mayor, for as long as Adam West held the office, ran the town with a style of governance that the show never fully explained, but that always felt internally consistent. Adam West, the mayor, operated from a set of principles that were entirely his own, not obviously connected to any political tradition or governing philosophy, but coherent in their own framework. He believed strongly in his own judgment. He acted decisively on whatever assessment he had made, regardless of whether that assessment bore any relationship to reality. He spent public money on personal vanity projects with the confidence of a man who does not experience the gap between public and private in the usual way. He declared emergencies that were not emergencies. He failed to declare some things that were clearly emergencies. He was re-elected repeatedly by a voting public that apparently preferred him to any available alternative. There is something in this portrait of local governance that lands differently than the show may have intended at its origin. The running joke of an incompetent but confidence-exuding mayor appealing to the electorate despite a demonstrable record of failure became, over the course of the show's run, a joke that has accumulated new dimensions as the real world kept producing public figures that rhymed with it. The show was not trying to make a political statement with Adam West, but political statements have a way of attaching themselves to things that were made without them. The Goldman family, Mort, Muriel, and their son Neil, occupy the space of the show's most consistently used secondary family. Mort is a pharmacist who runs a drugstore in the neighborhood. He is anxious, accident-prone, and possessed of what the show consistently frames as an encyclopedic knowledge of his own physical vulnerabilities. Neil Goldman has been in unrequited love with Meg for most of the show's run, a storyline the show has visited several times without ever resolving in either direction. There is something almost sweet about Neil's persistent attachment to Meg, given that they are both characters who are overlooked by most of the world around them. The show occasionally gestures toward this, toward the possibility that two people defined by their marginalization might recognize something in each other, but never commits to developing it. Muriel Goldman was killed in an episode in the 9th season, in a murder mystery storyline that also killed several other secondary characters. Her death was one of the show's genuine surprises. Secondary characters in animated comedies are rarely actually killed, as opposed to simply dying in ways that reset between episodes. And it changed Mort's characterization somewhat in the seasons that followed. He became a widower with a son and a pharmacy and a now permanently truncated family, and the show acknowledged this without making it the focus of his appearances. The Swanson family dynamic has its own arc across the show's run that the show handles with varying degrees of commitment. Bonnie Swanson spent several seasons pregnant, which became a running joke about the show's timeline, before finally giving birth to a daughter named Susie. Joe and Bonnie's marriage went through difficulties in the later seasons that the show treated as serious character material rather than simply plot mechanics, dealing with questions of resentment and distance that develop in relationships where one partner has experienced a significant loss of physical capacity. Their son Kevin, who had appeared occasionally as a teenager, was briefly killed in action in a military setting and then revealed to be alive in a later episode. The reversal handled with the same casual relationship to continuity that the show brings to most of its more dramatic gestures. The Swanson household across the street from the Griffins was always a kind of parallel reflection of the Griffin household. Where Peter and Lois have Kay, Joe and Bonnie have order, or at least the appearance of it. Where Peter is defined by impulse, Joe is defined by discipline. Where the Griffin household is always on the edge of some new disaster, the Swanson household presents the surface of stability that the show occasionally uses to remind its audience of what the Griffins are not. But the reflection reveals something interesting when you look at it long enough. The stability in the Swanson household is also a kind of rigidity. Joe's discipline is also a kind of inability to adapt. The order is maintained in part through Joe's refusal to fully acknowledge or integrate certain kinds of change. And the resentment that eventually develops in Bonnie is partly the consequence of being in a household where the maintenance of appearances has taken precedence over the acknowledgement of what everyone in the house actually feels. This is a show, ultimately, about households, about the specific configurations of people who live together and what those configurations do to everyone involved. The Griffins are the loudest and most visible of these configurations, but the Swansons next door, and the house that Glenn occupies at number 29, and all the other residences on Spooner Street, are all engaged in their own versions of the same basic enterprise. People trying to live together, trying to be good enough at it to stay, and mostly managing to do so despite everything. Section 9, the ancestor line, where the Griffins came from. To understand the Griffin family in the present, it helps to understand where they came from, because the show's approach to history is one of its most consistent and creatively ambitious running threads. Over the course of its run, Family Guy has produced an extended portrait of the Griffin and Pewterschmidt ancestral lines that spans from the Paleolithic era to the future, touching nearly every major historical period along the way. The overall shape of this ancestral history tells you something important about the show's worldview. Every generation produces a version of Peter, or a version of the broader family dynamic, that runs directly into the significant events of its era and produces outcomes that are simultaneously plausible and absurd. The Griffins have never been on the right side of history for principled reasons. They have been wherever history was happening because history keeps finding them, and their presence in it tends to make things stranger and funnier, and occasionally worse. The earliest ancestor introduced in the show is Peter, the Paleolithic ancestor who invented the wheel. This is presented as a genuine creative achievement, something that put the Griffin name on the right side of at least one historical event. Peter looks exactly like Peter, because all of the Griffin ancestors look exactly like Peter, which is the visual joke that makes the whole ancestral history work. No matter what era you are in, no matter what the context, you can immediately identify the Griffin ancestor, because he has Peter's face and Peter's body and Peter's particular bearing. From the Bronze Age, there is Moses Griffin, who led the Israelites out of Egypt. Moses Griffin's commandments include his now famous instruction not to read billboards aloud while he is trying to move a large group of people through the desert. He parted the Red Sea. He received the law. He was exhausted by the experience and made no effort to hide it. The humor here is not disrespectful to the religious tradition, so much as it is specific about the human reality of leadership. That the people leading great movements are often simply tired men doing their best and hoping everyone will just keep walking in the right direction. Moving forward through time, there is a King Arthur version of Peter who approached the legend of Excalibur with the specific kind of motivated compromising that defines Peter's general approach to goals he does not quite want to fully pursue. There is Ponce de Leon Griffin, the explorer who found the Fountain of Youth and waded into it and emerged with an adult head on an infant's body, having not fully thought through the implications of stepping into a body of water that reverses aging when you are not a young person. There is John Wilkes Griffin, the great-great-grandfather whose portrait appears in one version of the family history. He was present at Ford's Theater on the night Abraham Lincoln was shot, and the reason Lincoln was shot was because Lincoln did bunny ears behind John Wilkes's head in a photography booth, and John Wilkes took such fierce personal offense at this small humiliation that he shot the president. This is, in the show's telling, how the assassination happened. A petty grievance escalated catastrophically because one of Peter Griffin's ancestors had no sense of proportion, which, if you know Peter, sounds exactly right. Peter Hitler, Adolf's brother, has already been discussed, but his role in the ancestral history is worth pausing on for its implication. The joke is not that the Griffin family contains a Nazi. The joke is that they contain someone so fundamentally harmless and so thoroughly irritating that his presence in the inner circle of the Third Reich was essentially an act of cosmic sabotage. Peter Hitler did not undermine fascism through courage or principle. He undermined it through sheer, persistent annoyingness. And in the end, his accidental killing of Hitler and Eva Braun and his subsequent cover-up of the deaths means that, in the show's history, the end of the Second World War can be attributed in some indirect way to a Griffin. There is the story of Griffin Peterson, whom we have already discussed, the colonial ancestor who founded the town by winning a talent competition. But there is more to his story. Griffin Peterson had a past life as a pirate, which the show reveals in the episode Peter's Progress, where Cleveland's Jamaican cousin reads Peter's palm and discovers layers of past lives. In one past life, Peter was a court jester. In another, he was a prominent pirate. In another, he was Jack the Ripper, though this appears to conflict with the same designation given to Glenn. And the show does not resolve the contradiction, which is characteristic. The Pewterschmidt side of the family history is less thoroughly explored, but what exists is equally fascinating. Silas Pewterschmidt, an early American ancestor, is shown in one episode as a colonist who negotiated with Native Americans by holding a knife to a baby's throat. He also, as it turns out, owned Nate Griffin as a slave, which is the foundational connection between the two family lines. The man who would become Peter's ancestor and the man who would become Lois's ancestor were bound together by the specific horror of American slavery, and their descendants fell in love across that history without fully understanding the weight of what they were carrying. There is also a Pewterschmidt ancestral line that connects to German roots. Carter mentions at one point that his own German grandmother is alive and living in Brazil, which he discovers while making his annual Christmas call to her. This is mentioned once and never returned to. The show occasionally drops these details like seeds without clearly intending to grow them, and the result is that the Griffin and Pewterschmidt family trees are full of branches that lead somewhere interesting and then stop. Looking forward in time, the show has also produced glimpses of the future that are scattered across multiple episodes and do not necessarily all fit together into a single coherent timeline. There is a future shown in Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, the direct-to-DVD film that was later broken into episodes, where Stewie travels forward in time and meets his 35-year-old self. This future Stewie, named Stu Griffin, works in a dead-end job and lives in a small apartment and is thoroughly disillusioned with his life. He did not take over the world. He did not become the ruler of anything. He just became a tired adult who could still remember when he had plans. There is the future depicted in Back to the Pilot, which shows a timeline where Brian and Stewie's time travel activities create a chain of changes that produces a nuclear war between the United States and a resurrected Confederacy, leaving the town irradiated and everyone mutated. This is the timeline the show prevents from occurring by eventually fixing the original alteration. But its existence in the show's fabric is a reminder that the world of Family Guy is actually quite fragile, and that the adventures Stewie and Brian keep going on are operating in a universe where the stakes are genuinely high. The Ancestor thread and the Future Glimpse thread are the two ends of the Griffin family story, where they came from and where they might be going. And together they suggest something about the show's fundamental stance on human history. History keeps repeating itself because the same kinds of people keep getting themselves into the same kinds of situations. The Griffin family has been present at every significant moment in the development of civilization, and their presence has consistently made things stranger and more complicated and more human. They are not heroes of history. They are participants in it, stumbling forward through time the same way they do through every episode, with no clear plan, some accidental competence, and a consistent inability to fully understand the consequences of their own actions. Which, when you think about it, is a pretty accurate description of how history actually works. There are additional ancestors worth naming because the show's approach to the Griffin family tree has been one of its most consistently creative recurring elements. Ulysses S. Griffin, Peter's great-great-uncle, is a parody of the Civil War general and American president. The show's version of how the Civil War ended involves Ulysses S. Griffin and Robert E. Lee settling the conflict over a beer-drinking contest, with Griffin winning. The compromise they reach, no more slavery, but no obligation to read, is the show's compressed commentary on the compromises of Reconstruction, delivered in a single absurdist joke that somehow contains both comedy and genuine historical commentary if you press on it. There is Ella Fitzgerald Griffin, Peter's great-aunt, who performs in a jazz club while a young, sighted Ray Charles accompanies her on piano. The anachronism here, Ray Charles lost his sight as a child, and his career as a professional musician began after that, is absolutely intentional. The show is not accidentally wrong about history. It is deliberately wrong about history in ways that produce comedy while gesturing at the real historical record. There is Angus Griffin, who helped invent golf. There is King of Denmark Griffin, a 14th century monarch who died of a heart attack at an enormous dinner table because no doctor could get to him in time. And the resulting death is presented as the reason Danish people now prefer small tables. This is the kind of specific, absurdist historical claim that functions as the show's signature approach to the past. Taking something real, Danish furniture design preferences, which do actually run toward the compact and the elegant, and inventing a completely ridiculous founding story for it. There is Osias Griffin, who owned the 8th telephone ever made, and whose phone number was 3. The joke being that even with only 8 telephones in existence, his was not the right number. He frequently received calls meant for phone number 7, which is somehow the most relatable piece of Griffin family history in the entire archive. The Pewterschmidt ancestral line has its own dark qualities. The episode Peter Griffin, husband, father, brother, from the 3rd season introduces the broader history of the Pewterschmidt family's relationship to Peter's African-American ancestors, establishing the original connection between the two family lines that the Griffin family history episode later explores in more detail. Silas Pewterschmidt, as a character, represents the specific form of American amnesia in which great families prefer not to examine the foundations of their wealth too carefully. Carter Pewterschmidt's fortune, which sits at the center of the Lois and Peter marriage dynamic, and which Carter wields with casual authority throughout the show, is built on a history that includes the ownership of Peter's own ancestors. The show never makes this the central point of any single episode, which is arguably both a failure and a choice. It introduces the historical connection and then allows it to be present in the background. a piece of context that shapes how you read the relationship between Carter and Peter, and between the Pewterschmidt wealth and the Griffin life, without forcing a direct confrontation. Whether this represents the show handling something sensitive with appropriate restraint or declining to engage with something important is a question that does not have a clean answer. What the ancestral history achieves, across all its individual entries, is a portrait of the Griffin family as American family, in the fullest and most complicated sense. They have been here for a long time. They have been shaped by the forces of history, slavery, war, immigration, religion, class, in ways that persist in who Peter and Lois and their children are today. The chaos of the present has specific roots in the past, roots that the show occasionally digs up and examines and then covers over again, in the way that families tend to. The ancestors look like Peter. They all look like Peter. And every era they appear in, they are recognizably themselves. Flawed, impulsive, occasionally brilliant, fundamentally human. The Griffin face on a medieval king is funny. It is also a statement. This family has always been exactly this family. History changes everything around them. They remain themselves. Section 10. The Chicken, the Clam, and the Cosmos. Recurring mythologies. Every long-running show develops its own internal mythology, the recurring characters and situations and rules that give the world its texture and make it feel lived in rather than assembled. Family Guy has a richer mythology of recurring elements than most people realize, because the show's gag-based structure tends to make individual moments feel self-contained, even when they are actually part of something larger. The most famous piece of this mythology is Ernie the Giant Chicken. He is a giant chicken, an anthropomorphic, bipedal, enormous rooster who lives in the same town as the Griffins, has a wife named Nicole, has children, apparently owns a car, and has been in a continuous, intermittent physical conflict with Peter Griffin for the show's entire run. He dresses like a civilian. He appears at restaurants and train stations and country clubs. He has what appears to be a normal social life, to the extent that a giant anthropomorphic chicken can have one. The feud between Peter and Ernie began with a coupon. This is revealed in the Season 2 episode Da Boom, in a flashback that explains the original conflict. Ernie gave Peter a coupon that turned out to be expired. Peter, who has never had a proportionate response to anything, attacked Ernie rather than simply accepting the disappointment. Ernie fought back, and the two of them have been fighting ever since. However, the show also introduced a complication in a later episode called Meet the Quagmires, where Peter travels back in time and accidentally punches Ernie at a high school dance. This creates a retroactive second origin for the feud, suggesting that even before the coupon incident, something was already in place between them that would eventually have found its way into violence regardless. Ernie himself, at the time of this accidental punch, is stopped by a friend who tells him to calm down because he will probably never see this person again. This is one of the show's better callbacks, the use of time travel to layer, meaning onto an already established relationship by showing its origins from a different angle. The fights themselves have become one of the show's most distinctive set pieces. They are extended, highly choreographed action sequences that pause the main story of the episode entirely and launch into something that looks more like a Hong Kong action film than an animated sitcom. Peter and Ernie destroy everything around them: buildings, vehicles, urban infrastructure, bystanders' property, and occasionally bystanders themselves, in battles that can last several minutes and range across entire sections of the town. Peter always wins, in the sense that Ernie is always left seemingly dead when Peter walks away. And Ernie is never actually dead. The camera lingers on him after Peter leaves, showing him open one eye, or move one claw, or smile. He is, for all practical purposes, immortal. Every defeat is a temporary setback from which he recovers in time for the next encounter. In one of the most tonally surprising episodes built around this rivalry, Peter and Ernie resolve their conflict. They sit down to dinner, Ernie brings his wife Nicole, and the two of them acknowledge that this whole thing started over an expired coupon, and that perhaps it has gone on long enough. It is a genuinely warm scene played with something close to sincerity. And then, while arguing over who will pay the dinner bill, the fight starts again. The reconciliation and the renewed conflict happen within minutes of each other, which is the show's way of acknowledging that some relationships are defined by their conflict, and that the conflict does not end just because both parties know it should. The show's internal mythology extends to its relationship with God. God appears in multiple episodes and is voiced, when fully realized, with a kind of casual authority that sits between divine and bureaucratic. He exists. He has opinions. He makes appearances in human affairs when the situation seems to call for it. He plays games with other cosmic entities. He has a sense of humor about his own creation, most dramatically demonstrated in the cosmological sequence from the Griffin Family History episode, where the Big Bang is depicted as God igniting his own flatulence with a lighter while playing a card game. Death is a recurring character, voiced in a way that captures his essential quality, profoundly tired of his job and the expectations it creates, but committed to it in the way that civil servants often are. He has a personal life. He has needs and preferences and complaints. He exists in the show as something between a supernatural force and a regular person who happens to have an unusually unusual occupation, and his interactions with the Griffins across multiple episodes have accumulated into one of the show's more interesting extended portraits of what it might be like to be responsible for the end of every life. There is Meg's nemesis at school, Connie D'Amico, who represents the specific cruelty that popular teenagers can direct toward the ones they have designated as acceptable targets. There is Principal Shepard, the school principal. There is Jake Tucker, Tom Tucker's son, who was born with an upside-down face, which Tucker the newsman reports on neutrally because he is always neutral about everything, including his own personal tragedies. There is Jerome, who runs the Drunken Clam for a period, and whose backstory with Lois creates one of the show's more genuinely uncomfortable love triangle situations. There is James Woods, the actual actor James Woods, who voices a version of himself as a recurring antagonist. Woods' history with Peter is complicated in ways that the show unpacks gradually across multiple appearances. He was at one point Peter's friend. He then betrayed Peter in a way significant enough to create lasting animosity. He has appeared as a villain, as a prisoner, as a celebrity ruining Brian's creative work, and as a recurring presence at the edge of the show's world. A reminder that fame and access do not necessarily translate into the kind of character that makes someone trustworthy. There is a character called Consuela who works as a cleaner for multiple families in the neighborhood and who communicates almost exclusively through the word no delivered in varying registers of firmness. There is Ollie Williams, the weatherman at Channel 5 News, who reports all weather information in the same format. Brief, percussive, shouted. It's gonna rain. Tornado warning. Looks like snow. There is Tom Tucker himself, the news anchor, whose personal vanity and professional pomposity are the show's sustained commentary on local television journalism. These recurring presences give the world of the show its density. They are the evidence that this is not just the story of one family in a vacuum, but a whole town full of people living their complicated lives, occasionally intersecting with the Griffin chaos, occasionally generating their own. The mythology that has grown up around them across 25 seasons is the closest thing the show has to a living document of its own world. Not fully consistent, not always internally logical, but deeply felt and strangely coherent in the way that real communities are. The Death character deserves additional attention, because his role in the show's mythology extends further than most people realize. Death in this show is a person with a job. He has existential fatigue about the scope of his responsibilities. He is not malevolent. He is not trying to end lives. He is processing them as they complete, and the volume of the work is staggering. In the episodes where Death appears as a character rather than an abstract force, he exhibits a kind of civil servant weariness that is simultaneously funny and genuinely affecting. He has preferences. He would rather not work nights. He has visited so many households in his line of work that the individual households have started to blur together. His first major appearance in the Season 1 episode Death is a Bitch establishes the template. Peter is declared legally dead due to a paperwork error. Death comes to collect him. Peter injures Death, and in a reversal of the usual power dynamic, Death must recuperate at the Griffin house while Peter temporarily takes over his responsibilities. The episode is a masterclass in comedic escalation. The idea of Peter Griffin, of all people, being responsible for the deaths of living creatures is genuinely alarming. But it also establishes death as a character rather than a symbol, which allows the show to continue using him with real comedic and occasionally emotional effectiveness. The recurring presence of God is handled with a different energy. God in this show is confident. He is decisive. He acts without appearing to feel any particular anguish about the consequences of his actions. He has a sense of humor, though it can be difficult to distinguish this humor from the general chaos of a universe that runs according to his specifications. He plays games. He has favored outcomes. He intervenes occasionally, and when he does, it is not always clear that his intervention constitutes improvement over what would have happened without it. The show has never been atheist in its treatment of God's existence. God exists in this universe. The question is not whether there is a God, but what that God is like, and the answer the show tends to produce is remarkably unconcerned with individual outcomes, broadly interested in his creation continuing, and possessed of a personal style that can only be described as casually cosmic. He is not cruel. He is not kind exactly. He is present and vast and operating according to priorities that the characters around him are not positioned to fully evaluate. The giant chicken feud has its own mythology that extends beyond the individual episodes. We know that Ernie has a wife named Nicole, a family life, and a social existence that runs parallel to Peter's. We know that Nicole and Lois have their own separate conflict that mirrors the Peter and Ernie feud, established in a later episode where the two women get into a fight at a coffee shop that escalates similarly to the men's battles while being somehow more contained. We know that Ernie has children, one of whom eventually becomes romantically involved with Meg, in an episode that takes the meta element of the ongoing feud and makes it literal. What would it mean for these two families to attempt connection through the next generation? That episode, called The Chicken or the Meg, is an interesting piece of late-period Family Guy that takes the chicken mythology seriously enough to develop it rather than simply repeat the established joke. Meg meets Ernie's son, Nugget. Nugget is a good person, or a good chicken at least, and Meg and Nugget develop a genuine connection. Peter's reaction to the relationship is his standard reflexive hostility to anything involving Nugget's family. But the episode pushes further than usual by having Peter confront the absurdity of allowing an expired coupon, the seed of the whole original feud, to prevent his daughter from being happy. The episode ends with a kind of truce, as most of the chicken episodes eventually do, though not one that anyone expects to hold. The mythology of the drunken clam is quiet but important. This is the place where Peter has spent most of his adult social life. The bar has a regularity and a comfort to it that represents the stable center of his world outside the Griffin house. Peter's relationships with his friends, which are the most consistent things in his life, are maintained primarily through the ritual of showing up at the same place at the same time and sitting down together. There is something almost ceremonial about this. The four friends at their table, the drinks on the bar, the conversation about nothing in particular that somehow constitutes the backbone of their adult male friendship. Horace, who runs the bar, is not a detailed character. He is, in the framework of the show, a piece of set dressing with a voice and a name. But his consistent presence across 25 seasons of episodes has given him a kind of weight by accumulation. He is always there. The bar is always open. When Peter needs to be somewhere that is not his house and not anywhere significant, he goes to the Drunken Clam and Horace is behind the bar and the beer is cold and the light is the same dim, warm light it has always been. There is something in this that the show does not comment on, but that is there if you are paying attention. The Drunken Clam is the place where Peter is most himself, most comfortable, most unchallenged. It is also the place where the least amount of growth ever happens. The bar is the counterpoint to everything the show occasionally suggests Peter could become. It is where he goes to not become it, to just be the version of himself that has always existed. Drinking beer with the same friends in the same chairs, safe from the demands of change. This is the mythology of the bar. It is not grand, it is not heroic, but it is real and recognizable, and the show has always known exactly what it was doing when it put Peter in that chair. Section 11. The wildest episodes ever made. There are episodes of Family Guy that exist in a category of their own, pieces of television that push the show's capabilities to their limits and come back with something that no other animated comedy was doing at the time or has quite replicated since. Da Boom! The Season 2 episode that aired on December 26, 1999, is the first episode to make the case for how ambitious Family Guy could be when it wanted to be. It begins with the Y2K panic, the genuine widespread anxiety at the turn of the millennium that computer systems would fail catastrophically at midnight on January 1st, 2000. In the show's version of events, the panic is justified. The computers do fail. Everything does collapse. And the Griffins find themselves navigating a post-apocalyptic wasteland where society has broken down and survival has become the immediate priority. What follows is a sustained piece of genre storytelling that commits to its premise more fully than most comedy shows would be comfortable doing. The family walks across the ruins of their civilization. They encounter other survivors in various states of coping and denial. They are trying to reach a specific location, drawn by the memory of a Twinkie factory that Peter believes might still have products in it. The apocalypse is funny, but it is also genuinely bleak in ways that feel honest rather than gratuitous. And this is also the episode that introduces Ernie the Giant Chicken for the first time, in a fight that establishes the template for every subsequent encounter. PTV from the 5th season is a piece of television that manages to be genuinely sharp, satirical commentary while also being extremely funny. The premise, the FCC responding to a moment of accidental public nudity involving Peter, begins aggressively censoring network television. In response, Peter starts his own cable channel called PT-Fi, which broadcasts content without restriction. The FCC then extends its censorship to everyday life, placing physical censor bars and audio bleeps on actual human existence rather than just on broadcast media. The episode is an extended argument about censorship, freedom of expression, and the relationship between regulatory bodies and creative work, delivered in the most Family Guy way possible. The episode Brian and Stewie from the 8th season has already been discussed, but deserves revisiting in the context of the show's wildest creative choices. Because the choice to do an episode with no cutaways, no external plot, and no characters other than two people in a room talking is, for Family Guy, one of the most radical things it ever attempted. The show's entire identity was built on rapid movement, quick cuts, and the momentum of constant novelty. Doing the opposite of that, slowing everything down to the pace of a real conversation, with real pauses and real silences and real vulnerability, was a risk that could have felt like a stunt, and instead felt like a revelation. Partial Terms of Endearment, from the 8th season, is one of the most controversial episodes in the show's history, significant enough that Fox declined to air it in the United States, broadcasting it only in other countries before it was eventually included in DVD releases. The episode deals with surrogate motherhood and includes a subplot addressing abortion rights. The episode's treatment of its subject matter was considered too explicitly political for broadcast by the network, which was already in a complicated relationship with a show whose creator had been increasingly critical of its parent company's news division. The episode is not the show's finest work, but its existence as a suppressed text says something interesting about the show's relationship with the network, and about the difference between the kinds of transgression Fox was comfortable with and the kinds it was not. Not All Dogs Go to Heaven, from the 7th season, is built around the premise of the cast of Star Trek. The Next Generation appearing at a fan convention and Meg becoming deeply religious after a personal crisis. The episode features the entire TNG cast: Patrick Stewart, Brent Spiner, LeVar Burton, Michael Dorn, Jonathan Frakes, Gates McFadden, and Marina Sirtis, in an extended subplot where Stewie kidnaps them for a science experiment. It is simultaneously a love letter to Star Trek fandom and a fairly audacious piece of celebrity casting, and the fact that all 7 principal actors agreed to participate in an extended parody of themselves suggests that the show had earned enough goodwill with certain audiences to get away with things that more cautious shows could not. The road to episodes, which we have already explored in depth, belong in this category not individually, but as a body of work. Taken together, they represent a sustained effort to do something different, To build an adventure serial with genuine emotional stakes and real character development inside a format that was otherwise dedicated to rapid, disposable comedy. That they succeeded as often as they did is remarkable. The Simpsons Guy, the hour-long crossover episode from the 13th season, is a landmark in animation history simply for what it required to bring into existence. Getting the two most significant animated sitcoms of the past 30 years into the same episode with their full original cast, in a story that engaged directly with the long-running rivalry and creative friction between the two shows, required negotiations and permissions and creative agreements that were genuinely complex to achieve. The result is an episode that is more interested in the meta-commentary than in pure comedy, but the meta-commentary is genuinely interesting. A conversation between two shows about their own similarities and differences, filtered through the specific personalities of their characters. In this episode, Peter Griffin and Homer Simpson meet. They drink together. They discover they have more in common than perhaps either would prefer to acknowledge. Meanwhile, their families interact in ways that pair characters by type. Chris and Bart, Meg and Lisa, Stewie and Maggie, Brian and Santa's little helper. The show is aware that it has been compared to The Simpsons since its first episode, and it uses the crossover to engage with that comparison directly rather than avoid it. Peter and Homer are not the same man, the episode argues. They emerged from the same archetype but became different characters because of the different worlds they inhabit, the different families around them, the different sensibilities of the shows they anchor. The climax involves Peter and Homer fighting, which resolves when Homer forgives Peter, in a moment of animated generosity that the episode earns by making it feel genuinely felt rather than obligatory. It is a piece of television that probably should not exist but does, and is better than it had any right to be. Section 12. The Things You Never Notice. There is a layer to this show that most people never access, not because it is hidden exactly, but because the pace of the humor tends to pull your attention forward before the background has fully registered. This section is about the background. The skyline visible from behind the Griffin house, glimpsed in many exterior shots across the entire run of the show, features 3 real buildings from downtown Providence, Rhode Island. Specifically, One Financial Plaza, 50 Kennedy Plaza, and the Bank of America Tower. The placement of these buildings relative to the foreground action has actually been used by fans to triangulate approximately where in the Providence metro area this fictional town would have to be located if it existed in reality. Based on the angle and the relative sizes, the consensus is that the town is somewhere west of downtown Providence, consistent with real neighborhoods like Cranston or Johnston. The real-world address of 31 Spooner Street in Providence places it immediately west of Roger Williams Park, which is itself named after the founder of Rhode Island. This means that if you go to Providence today and find 31 Spooner Street, you are standing at an address that is, in the real world, in a real residential neighborhood adjacent to one of the state's most significant landmarks. McFarlane named Spooner Street after a road near his childhood home in Kent, Connecticut. The street 1 block over from Spooner Street in the show's world is called McFarlane, a direct personal reference to the creator, placed quietly in the geography of his creation. The Griffin house itself has a history that the show has revealed across multiple episodes. The house was purchased after a lawsuit involving a broken condom. The lawsuit resulted in the birth of Chris, and the family used the settlement to buy the property. Carter and Barbara Pewterschmidt have been quietly subsidizing the mortgage for years, which Peter periodically acknowledges and immediately stops thinking about. In one episode, Lois warns Peter that they are technically renting the property. In another, Peter sends in a mortgage coupon with a fake check and hopes for the best. The house appeared on no official maps for years. When Stewie and Brian traveled back to the first episode in Back to the Pilot, one of the things they observe is that the town's geographic coverage in 1999 was significantly different from what it would become. Details that were vague in the early episodes had been retroactively specified by later ones, and time travel allowed the show to acknowledge this. There is a murder in the house's history. An episode reveals, in passing, that a woman named Doris Billingsley was killed in the Griffin home in 1962, possibly over a burnt dinner. This detail is not pursued further, but its presence in the show's fabric is characteristic of the way Family Guy drops dark little specifics into the background of everyday life. The Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, where Peter works, is a lightly fictional version of the Narragansett Brewing Company, a Rhode Island institution. The ale itself is named after the nearby city of Pawtucket, which, as we noted earlier, was the city whose mayor was offended by a previous show written by a Family Guy writer, leading to the decision to create a fictional town rather than set the show in a real one. The Drunken Clam has an address. Horace the bartender has a wife who appears briefly in one episode. The bar has a back room that has been used for various plot-relevant purposes across multiple seasons. There's a bowling alley nearby that appears in several episodes. The town has a zoo, a museum, a harbor, a beach, a community theater, and a cable access station where Peter briefly hosted his own show. The full zip code for the town, as revealed in the episode Foxy Lady, is 00093. This is not a real zip code. Real Rhode Island zip codes begin with 028 or 029. But 00093 has become, among dedicated fans of the show, a piece of trivia as well known as any other fact about the fictional geography. Some of the show's most interesting background details involve the way character histories connect across episodes in ways that were not necessarily planned but became consistent through use. The fact that Quagmire and Peter knew each other in the Navy, the fact that Joe became Peter's neighbor before Quagmire did, the fact that Cleveland's connection to the group predates the Spooner Street period. All of these details emerged gradually from different episodes and now form a prehistory for the friend group that gives their current dynamic a sense of depth. The show's relationship with the fourth wall has generated its own body of lore. Peter has addressed the audience directly. Characters have referenced being on a television show. Stewie has occasionally broken the frame entirely to comment on the narrative structure of an episode in real time. These moments of meta-awareness are not consistent in how much they acknowledge, but they have created a texture of self-referentiality that gives the show's world a slightly unstable quality, as if everyone in it suspects they might be fictional and has made a personal decision about how to feel about that. There are backgrounds that have been reused in different contexts, showing glimpses of the same painted landscapes in episodes that are ostensibly taking place in different locations. There are animation models that have been recycled as background characters, who then coincidentally appear in later episodes in positions that suggest they are distinct individuals. The show's world is populated with extras who exist purely as visual texture, and some of them have appeared so many times in the background that fans have begun giving them names and backstories. This is the world. It is thick with detail and thin with explanation, which is probably the right balance for a universe that lives primarily in the space between jokes. The jokes pass quickly. The world they happen in stays, accumulating meaning and texture and strange coherence over 25 seasons, becoming more itself with every episode that adds another layer to the foundation. Section 13. The Road Not Taken. What could have been? There are episodes that were written and then not made, storylines that were planned and then abandoned, creative directions the show considered and then stepped back from. These abandoned possibilities are their own kind of lore. The shadow version of what Family Guy is, visible in the spaces between what it chose to be. Seth MacFarlane has noted in various interviews over the years that there were periods in the show's development where significant creative changes were considered. In the early seasons, before the show was canceled, there were discussions about deepening certain characters' arcs in ways that the cancellation interrupted. The 3-year gap between the original run and the revival necessarily buried some of these intentions because the writers who returned were not all the same writers who had been building toward those conclusions. There is a version of Stewie Griffin who was never softened, a version of the character who maintained his evil genius characterization through all 20-plus seasons, whose schemes grew in ambition rather than fading, who became genuinely frightening rather than becoming charming. Seth MacFarlane has been asked about this version in interviews, and his answer is consistent. The writers felt they had exhausted the evil baby premise before it exhausted itself. They walked away from something still capable of producing creative work because they stopped believing in it before it stopped being viable. Whether this assessment is correct is a matter of genuine debate among people who love the show. The counter-argument, which the transcript provided as a framework for this project makes clearly, is that the show went on to produce far more seasons with the softer Stewie than it ever did with the evil one, which means either the softened version was more fertile creatively, or it was more commercially comfortable, which are different things. The evil Stewie might have produced 10 more seasons of increasingly ambitious villainy. We will never know, because the decision to change him was made and not reversed. There is a version of Brian Griffin who stopped being used as a political mouthpiece and remained the grounded, empathetic character of the earliest seasons. Brian in the first 2 or 3 seasons has a specific quality of observational intelligence that is distinct from the soapboxing that came to define him later. He makes jokes about Peter's plans that are funny because they are accurate rather than funny because they come with a lecture attached. He offers advice that comes from a place of care rather than from a place of wanting to be right. That version of Brian was genuinely one of the best characters on the show, and the path the show chose for him after the revival is one of the things that most clearly identifies the difference between the early seasons and what came after. There are episodes that Fox declined to air, partial terms of endearment, which we discussed earlier. There was an episode in season 3 called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, which dealt with Peter's response to a Jewish stereotype character, and which Fox held for nearly 2 years before eventually airing it after the show's cancellation and revival, when the network had less leverage over its content decisions. The episode is actually quite thoughtful about its subject matter, which may have been part of why Fox was uncertain about it. The show was more willing than the network to engage with complicated ideas rather than just playing them as one-note jokes. There is also the question of what the show might have been if Seth MacFarlane had stayed more actively involved in its creative direction through the second decade of its run. The Orville, the science fiction series he created and wrote for Hulu beginning in 2017, is revealing in this contest. That show is warm, character-focused, emotionally invested, willing to slow down and let scenes breathe, genuinely interested in the ethical questions it raises. It is a show made by someone who cares deeply about what it is saying and how it is saying it. Family Guy, after roughly 2011, when MacFarlane stepped away from the day-to-day writing, became something more diffuse. Still capable of brilliant episodes, still capable of genuine feeling, but less consistently guided by a single clear vision of what the show was trying to be. The version of Family Guy that was still firing on all creative cylinders is the one you find in the first 7 seasons, with particular peaks in seasons 1 through 3. The version that exists in later seasons is not without merit. There are individual episodes across seasons 8 through the present that are as good as anything the show ever produced. But they exist as exceptions, rather than the rule, islands of quality in a larger body of work that had settled into something more comfortable and less demanding. The road not taken is visible in those early seasons, in the care and precision of the writing, in the specificity of the character details, in the warmth underneath the chaos. The show was, for a brief and bright period, exactly as good as it was capable of being. And the fact that it occasionally manages to reach that level again even now, 25 years in, suggests that the potential was never entirely lost. It just became harder to access. Section 14. The Legacy. What 25 years leaves behind. There is a specific kind of longevity that belongs to things that become genuinely part of the culture. Not just popular, but embedded, referenced without attribution, because the reference has become too widely understood to need it. Absorbed into the shorthand of everyday conversation. When someone says, "Shut up, Meg," or "Giggity," or "How you doing?" In a specific way, they are drawing on something that has been circulating for decades, something that has passed through enough hands and context to become its own kind of folklore. Family Guy has that kind of longevity. It premiered in 1999 and was dead by 2002 and came back in 2005 and has been going ever since. As of the spring of 2025, it was announced that the show had secured a deal with Disney, which now owns Fox's entertainment assets, for 4 additional seasons, extending through season 27 and the 2028 to 2029 television season. That would bring the show to its 30th anniversary. 30 years of a family in a house on a street in Rhode Island that does not officially exist. The show changed the landscape of animated comedy. It proved that the adult animation format was not dependent on the Simpsons model, that there was room for a different kind of humor, faster and more fragmented, and more willing to abandon narrative coherence in favor of pure comedic velocity. It contributed to the vocabulary of internet comedy, particularly in the era of early YouTube when its cutaway gags were among the most shared video clips on the platform. demonstrating that the format of animated television could survive and thrive in clip form without the context of the full episode. It launched American Dad, which went on to develop its own dedicated audience and critical reputation. It launched The Cleveland Show. It contributed to the culture of animation-adjacent content that now includes shows like Archer and Rick and Morty and BoJack Horseman, shows that push the format in different directions, but that grew in a landscape partly shaped by what Family Guy demonstrated was possible. It changed the conversation about animated comedies' relationship to controversy, establishing that a primetime animated show could address religion, politics, race, sexuality, and death in ways that were more direct than anything that had come before, and that audiences would respond to this directness, even when, especially when, boss, it made them uncomfortable. It was nominated in 2009 for the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Comedy Series, the first animated show to receive this nomination since The Flintstones in 1961. Nearly 50 years between the two nominations, The Simpsons, which many consider the more prestigious and better sustained achievement in animated comedy, never received that particular nomination. Family Guy did. There are people who grew up with this show, who watched it as teenagers and young adults and absorbed its sensibility into the way they think about comedy, who can quote it at length, who have the characters' voices in their heads as a kind of internal default when they think about certain kinds of humor, who find that their relationship to the show is complicated now, layered with nostalgia and critical awareness and affection and frustration in proportions that shift depending on which episode they are thinking about. This is the particular feeling that belongs to 25 years of investment in a fictional world. It is not simple. It contains multitudes. It is possible to love something and also see it clearly, to hold the early seasons with genuine reverence and the later ones with genuine disappointment, and still find in both evidence of the same fundamental creative impulse, someone wanting very badly to make you laugh, to show you something about the world through the particular lens of this strange family and their strange house, to convince you that the chaos is worth staying in. The show's influence on comedy writing specifically deserves a moment of attention. The writers who developed their craft in the Family Guy writing room in the early seasons went on to work on some of the most significant comedy productions of the past 2 decades. The specific discipline of writing jokes that work in multiple layers simultaneously, funny on the surface, meaningful in the subtext, specific enough to reward attention, is a skill that was developed and refined at that particular show, and that has propagated outward through the industry in ways that are hard to fully trace but easy to recognize. The voice cast deserves recognition in the context of legacy as well. Seth MacFarlane, who voices Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Glenn, has sustained these 4 distinct vocal performances across 25 years, and the consistency of these voices across that span is a remarkable piece of craft. Each voice is specific. Peter's is based on a security guard MacFarlane overheard while a student at art school. Stewie's is based on Rex Harrison. Glenn's is based on 1950s radio pitchman and was described by MacFarlane as a 50s radio guy on cocaine. Brian's is MacFarlane's own natural speaking voice, which means that for 25 years, the show's creator has been expressing his own unmediated voice through one of his characters in every episode. The choice of which character to use as your natural voice is revealing. MacFarlane speaks as Brian. Brian, the failed intellectual with good instincts and poor follow-through, is the voice MacFarlane chose to claim as his own. Alex Borstein's Lois has been a constant across the full run of the show, and her performance has evolved subtly over time in ways that track the character's development, or regression in some periods, without losing the core of what makes Lois sound like Lois. Mila Kunis's Meg has similarly been consistent, a performance that by necessity spends a significant amount of time being the recipient of abuse and one-sided dynamics while still maintaining the dignity of a character rather than a prop. Seth Green's Chris has found a distinctive register for a character who is, by design, the most underexplored of the main family members. These performances are the bedrock beneath the animation, the thing that gives the characters their specific and irreplaceable quality. The show's musical contributions are often underappreciated. Walter Murphy, who has composed music for the show since its inception, has produced a body of work that functions as a distinctive sonic world for the show. identifiable, tone-appropriate, and varied enough to support everything from broad physical comedy to genuinely emotional moments. The songs produced for specific episodes, including the musical episode numbers that appear periodically across the run, represent a genuine creative achievement that sits somewhat outside the main discussion of the show, but that has contributed significantly to its identity. The show's ratings trajectory tells a specific story. 22 million viewers at launch, roughly 8 million at the revival peak in Season 4. A gradual decline through the subsequent seasons, reaching a low of around 723,000 viewers by the 23rd season. This is a decline of nearly 97% from the Super Bowl debut, though it is worth noting that the comparison to that number is somewhat unfair. The Super Bowl inflated the debut beyond what the show ever could have sustained. The more honest comparison is to the revival peak of 8 million in 2005. And from that figure, the decline to below 1 million is still stark and undeniable. But the show is not primarily sustained by its first-run ratings. It is sustained by its catalog, the decades of episodes available on streaming, the reruns running on Adult Swim and other cable networks, the merchandise, the gaming tie-ins, the brand recognition that means the name Family Guy is understood in markets worldwide. A show that reaches fewer than 1 million people on its first-run broadcast is still reaching tens of millions of people through other distribution paths. The business of Family Guy has decoupled from the cultural event of Family Guy in a way that makes the ratings numbers less devastating in context, though they remain a clear indicator of where the show sits in the cultural conversation relative to where it once was. 25 years. The house is still there, the mailbox is still green. The station wagon is in the driveway. Peter is inside, probably doing something that will result in a consequence he cannot fully anticipate. Lois is managing the aftermath. Meg is in her room, thinking clearly, unacknowledged. Chris is somewhere being sweetly oblivious. Stewie is in his nursery, building something, talking to Rupert about it in careful technical detail. Brian is sitting with his unfinished novel and his glass and the specific sadness of a person who wanted to be more than he has managed to become, and who has not yet given up on the idea that tomorrow might be the day he figures it out. And somewhere in the cosmological background, in the distant future where all roads lead eventually, a baby genius is going to sneeze or accidentally activate something or make a decision based on incomplete information, and the whole universe is going to begin. Which means that right now, in this moment, everything that exists, every star, every planet, every atom of matter, every joke you have ever laughed at, every late night you have spent watching this show, is a prelude to whatever Stewie Griffin does next. That is the lore. That is the strange, dense, layered mythology of a show about a family in Rhode Island that has been making people laugh and occasionally think for 25 years. Every corner of it leads somewhere strange. Every character has more history than you think. Every joke is sitting on top of something deeper, and if you slow down long enough to look at what is underneath it, what you find is not just comedy. You find a portrait of American family life refracted through the most peculiar possible lens and somehow still recognizable. The show is still going. The house is still there. The mailbox is still green. Good night. Supplementary. Chris Griffin. The Forgotten Middle Child. No complete account of this family's mythology is finished without spending real time on Chris Griffin, the middle child, the one who is so thoroughly defined by his sweetness and his obliviousness that it is easy to watch an entire episode he is in without quite registering what has happened to him. Chris Griffin is voiced by Seth Green, who also created the stop-motion animation series Robot Chicken, and who brought to the role a specific quality of earnest, guileless warmth that makes Chris one of the more likable characters in the show's main cast, even when the writing does not give him much to work with. His voice is a little higher than you would expect for a teenager of his size. It has a quality of perpetual mild surprise, as if the world keeps exceeding the modest expectations he brought to it. This is Chris. He is genuinely not sophisticated. He is genuinely not strategic. He is a boy who exists in the present tense, responding to what is immediately in front of him with whatever energy he has available. He shares his father's build and, it must be said, a significant portion of his father's intellectual profile. The show has established across multiple episodes that Chris is not academically gifted, and it handles this with the same mixture of affection and honesty that it brings to Peter's intellectual limitations. Chris is not unintelligent in the way that Peter is. He does not lack basic reasoning capacity, but he lacks the focused curiosity or the academic drive that might have channeled whatever intelligence he has into productive directions. He goes to school. He does not distinguish himself. He comes home. He eats. His most consistent characteristic, beyond the general sweetness, is a talent for art. Chris is genuinely artistically gifted, and the show acknowledges this across multiple episodes in a way that is one of its more interesting decisions about a character who is otherwise not given a great deal of specific depth. His drawings are good. His sense of visual composition is intuitive. He has a feeling for what things look like that his family members do not share. And when the show gives him the space to express this, in the episode where he takes an art class, in the episode where his work is recognized by someone with genuine expertise, there is something genuinely touching about watching a character whose other qualities have not been celebrated finally find the thing that he is actually good at. He also has, in his room, what the show refers to in passing as a recurring activity that the other family members choose not to investigate too closely. This is played as a joke about teenage boys and their habits of privacy, but it is handled with such consistent delicacy across many seasons, acknowledged but never depicted, referenced but never explained, that it has become one of the show's more effective, sustained gags, a piece of comedy that works entirely through implication. Chris's relationships within the family are among the show's underexplored territories. His dynamic with Meg in the early seasons was functional. Normal sibling energy, the kind of low-grade friction and occasional solidarity that characterizes most real sibling pairs. His relationship with Stewie is complicated by the vast difference in their intellectual sophistication, which Stewie does not allow Chris to forget. His relationship with Brian is largely one of mutual tolerance. His relationship with Peter contains the genetic inheritance problem. Chris can look at Peter and see the future of his own worst tendencies if he does not find a way to distinguish himself from the pattern. But the show rarely pushes this far enough to make it dramatically interesting. His best episode is probably one of the early middle period ones, where his artistic gift is taken seriously. But there's also something to be said for the episodes where his simple good nature provides a counterweight to the more complicated psychologies around him. In a household full of characters carrying histories and ambitions and grievances and fears, Chris Griffin's basic cheerfulness is not nothing. It is, in its way, its own kind of resilience. The ability to exist in the present, to be basically fine with what is in front of you, to not be consumed by everything that your family is consumed by. He is not a hero. He is not particularly interesting as a character study, but he is present, consistently, episode after episode, year after year, being sweetly himself in a household that does not always make room for sweetness. And that consistent presence has its own value in the ecology of the show, even if the writing has never quite figured out how to make him as central as he could be. The Griffin family needs Chris to be the way he is. They need someone in the house who is not calculating, who is not planning, who is not carrying the weight of a complicated personal history into every interaction. They need the person who just shows up and is glad to be there. And Chris, across 25 seasons, has reliably been that person. He is still at school. He is still working on whatever he works on in his room. He is still occasionally producing art that surprises people who did not expect it from him. And somewhere in the house on Spooner Street, in the family that Lois chose and that has kept choosing itself every season for a quarter century, he is there. Part of it. Uncomplicated in ways the rest of them cannot be. The Griffin family, taken all together, is not a simple collection of types. They are a collection of specific people with specific histories and specific capacities and specific failures, living together in a specific house in a specific fictional town, and making their strange, chaotic, occasionally genuinely moving life together. Every one of them is more than the show always remembers to show. Every one of them has a story that goes deeper than the jokes on the surface. That is the final piece of lore worth holding on to as the lights go down, and the voice fades, and the house on Spooner Street settles into the quiet of whatever night it is in that world right now. They are still there. They are still choosing each other, imperfectly and loudly and without sufficient self-awareness, but genuinely. And that is enough. Thank you. You spent a long time in this world tonight, and I hope it was worth it. Drop a comment and tell me what piece of this mythology hit you the hardest, whether it was Stewie's role in creating the universe, or Brian standing in front of his mother's taxidermied body, or Lois choosing chaos over comfort, or Meg, who always saw everything clearly. Tell me which story stayed with you when the lights go down. And if you have not subscribed yet, right now is the moment. Hit that button. We are building something here, and every person who joins this community makes the next video possible. There is so much more world left to explore, and we are going to explore all of it together. We will see you next time. Sleep well.